The champagne was still cold when Vivien Hart stepped into the ballroom and quietly ended her husband's life as he knew it. Grant Holston had arrived at the Celestia Grand Gala, believing he was untouchable, his mistress on his arm, his empire at its peak, his wife safely tucked away at home where she always stayed. He was wrong. For 7 months, while he was busy playing a dangerous game, Vivian was building a machine designed to destroy him piece by piece, dollar by dollar, share by share. Tonight she pulled the trigger in front of 300 of Crown City's most powerful people, and she did it with a smile. If you want to see how she did it, stay until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The Celestia Grand Hotel had hosted president scandals, and at least 2 secret weddings that Crown City still whispered about a decade later. But nothing in its 40-year history quite compared to what was about to unfold in its gilded ballroom on the third Friday of October. The Horizon Hope Gala was the crown jewel of Crown City's social calendar, a night where fortunes were pledged, reputations were cemented or shattered, and the powerful reminded each other with crystalline precision of who exactly held the keys to the city. The ballroom itself was a cathedral of carefully managed excess. Crystal chandeliers caught the light from 1,000 angles, throwing fractured rainbows across cream silk tablecloths that had been pressed to geometric perfection. White orchids flown in from Singapore that morning anchored every centerpiece, their fragrance filling the room with something expensive and slightly unreal. Servers in white jackets moved through the crowd with the practiced invisibility of furniture offering champagne that cost more per bottle than most people earned in a week, refilling glasses before they were ever quite empty. Grant Holston stood at the entrance to the main hall with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his 52 years seriously doubted his right to take up space. He cut an impressive figure, salt and pepper hair styled just carelessly enough to suggest he had better things to think about, though anyone who knew him understood that every detail of Grant Holston was meticulously calculated. A custom Tom Ford tuxedo that fit like an argument. The kind of posture that didn't come from good breeding, but from 30 years of forcing the world to accommodate you. At his side stood Lola Reyes, 29, ambitious, beautiful, in that sharp, hungry way that made men feel powerful for having captured her attention. She wore a crimson dress that announced itself the moment she entered a room. Dark hair swept into an elegant updo. Diamond earrings that caught the light every time she moved. Earrings Grant had given her last month, charged to a joint account his wife rarely checked. Lola worked in marketing at a boutique firm that occasionally contracted with Holston Industries, a professional connection that provided just enough plausible deniability for their very unprofessional relationship. She was smart enough to know what they were and young enough to believe it might become something more. Grant found this combination convenient and had never thought to examine it for what it actually was. A lie he'd outsourced the maintenance of to someone who had never agreed to carry it. "Everyone's staring," Lola murmured, her lips curving in a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Let them," Grant replied without looking at her, his gaze already scanning the room with the reflexive intelligence of a man who processed every social environment as terrain to be assessed. "You look stunning. They're jealous." But even Grant, wrapped in his armor of certainty and long-practiced arrogance, couldn't quite ignore the quality of the attention tracking their movement through the room tonight. These weren't the usual admiring glances he'd spent decades collecting. There was an edge to them, something watchful and contained like audience members who already knew the ending. Conversations seemed to pause and restart as he and Lola passed. Smiles arrived a half-second too quickly, held a beat too long, masks that might slip if the muscles behind them relaxed for even a moment. He filed it under paranoia. He was good at dismissing things he didn't want to examine. Margaret Chen materialized from the crowd with champagne in hand and mischief sparkling behind her polished smile. She was the city comptroller's wife, a woman who collected information the way other people collected art, obsessively, selectively, and with a clear eye toward eventual display. She wore a column of midnight blue and an expression of exquisite social alertness. "Grant, how wonderful." She kissed the air near his cheek. Her gaze traveled over Lola with the efficient assessment of someone taking inventory. "And this must be Lola. Isn't that dress fearless?" Not quite a compliment. The pause before her next sentence was exactly one beat too deliberate. Will Vivien be joining us tonight? I haven't seen her in simply ages. Such a shame she always misses these things. Grant's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Vivien isn't feeling well. She sends her regrets. What a pity. Margaret's eyes held something that looked dangerously like anticipation excitement, barely contained behind concern-shaped words. I'm sure the evening will be memorable regardless. She glided away before he could respond, leaving him with the uncomfortable sensation of having missed the punchline of a joke told entirely at his expense. That was weird, Lola said quietly, watching Margaret dissolve back into the crowd. Margaret's always been a gossip, Grant dismissed. But his hand had moved to his phone without his realizing it, scrolling through messages with the low-grade paranoia of a man who'd built an empire on knowing things before everyone else did. Business emails. A text from his COO about a zoning variance. The normal machinery of his life operating exactly as it should. So why did his instincts, battle-hardened through decades of boardroom combat, keep insisting that something was wrong? He put the phone away. He was being ridiculous. The ballroom continued filling with Crown City's power elite. Senator Michaels worked the room with his practiced booming laugh, the kind that had appeared in campaign advertisements and couldn't quite pass for spontaneous anymore. Tech mogul James Wu held court with his venture capital circle near the bar, dissecting startup valuations between sips of 30-year scotch, with the relaxed authority of men accustomed to being right. The Riverside Country Club set clustered near the orchid displays in their uniform of discreet surgery and inherited confidence, looking ageless and deeply pleased with everything which was their default setting. Grant had climbed into these circles through sheer force of will, something most of the people in this room couldn't honestly say. Unlike the trust fund dilettantes who smiled at him across negotiating tables and called him a friend at galas, he had started from genuine nothing. His father's small construction company had gone bankrupt when Grant was 17, leaving the family not just without money, but without the sense of identity that money had provided. The elder Holston had never quite recovered, had carried the failure around afterward like something he couldn't digest, coloring everything with a bitterness that Grant had spent his entire adult life running from. He'd worked his way through state college, taken a position at the bottom of a mid-tier real estate firm, and built Holston Industries through calculated risk, ruthless intelligence, and an absolute refusal to accept limitation. Buildings with his name on them pierced the Crown City skyline. Politicians returned his calls. Men envied him. Women wanted him. Or so he told himself. That hunger. That drive. He had always considered it the best thing about himself. It was also what had made him certain he deserved whatever he reached for, including Lola, including tonight, including the freedom to construct a parallel life while his wife stayed in their Riverside mansion, maintaining appearances with gracious efficiency, asking nothing of him except his presence at the social obligations that served them both. He'd married Vivien Hart 23 years ago, when she was 32, and burning with the quiet confidence of someone raised to know exactly who she was. She was the daughter of Harrison and Catherine Hart. Old money-deep roots in Crown City's founding families, the kind of pedigree that opened doors that talent and ambition alone couldn't unlock. The Hart name had secured the financing for his first major development at a moment when banks were still deciding whether Grant Holston was a serious person or an interesting gamble. Her family connections had delivered partnerships that took other men decades to cultivate. Her effortless social fluency had legitimized him in circles that still cared quietly and ruthlessly about bloodlines and social registers. What he'd offered her in return was forward momentum, ambition, a man who was going somewhere. What he'd delivered eventually was absence. Vivien ran her charitable foundation. She maintained their household. She attended her committee meetings and showed up to the events that mattered with the kind of poise that made other women study her from across rooms. She asked nothing of him except his presence at the obligations that served them both. She'd become so reliably gracious, so thoroughly accommodating that Grant had gradually stopped noticing her at all, had stopped considering her as a person with an interior life, and started thinking of her as a feature of his environment, elegant background, well-maintained, essentially static, and Lola was alive in ways that Vivien had stopped trying to be. That was how he narrated it to himself anyway. The version that cast him as a man too vital for what his marriage had become, rather than a man too self-absorbed to notice that he was systematically dismantling someone else's willingness to love him. A photographer from Crown City magazine approached with a professional smile. "Mind if I grab a shot for the society pages, Mr. Holston?" "Of course." Grant reached for Lola's arm. "Actually," the photographer interrupted gently, "I was hoping for just you, sir. We're running a feature on this year's major donors." The request was entirely reasonable. Lola stepped aside with practiced grace. Grant posed alone, his expression arranged in the confident, slightly self-deprecating smile that had appeared on 100 magazine covers, the look that communicated power without requiring the viewer to feel threatened by it. The photographer took several shots, reviewing each on the camera display with careful attention. "Perfect," he said finally. "Thank you, Mr. Holston. Enjoy your evening." He moved away into the crowd with the purposeful drift of someone who had somewhere specific to be next. Grant watched him go with a faint, inarticulate unease he couldn't quite locate or name. The man's professionalism had been impeccable, but underneath the practiced neutrality of his expression, Grant had sensed something qualitatively different from the usual society photographer energy. A quality not of celebration but of documentation, not capturing a moment but collecting evidence. He shook it off. "You okay?" Lola asked when he returned to her side. "Fine," he said shortly. "Let's find our table." They were seated at table 3, close enough to the stage to signal importance, but conspicuously not at the head table reserved for primary sponsors and board members. Grant frowned at his place card. He'd donated $100,000 to Horizon Hope last year. He should have been at table 1. His tablemates arrived steadily, Richard and Pauline Vandermeer, pharmaceutical fortune 4 generations deep. Thomas Wu, the tech mogul's younger brother, who ran a celebrated restaurant group with genuine warmth that made him the most likable person in any room. Jennifer Park, an architect whose work had won prizes and changed skylines. And Martin Chen Margaret's husband, city comptroller, a man of considerable quiet power who lived in perpetual anxiety about the appearance of impropriety. Conversation moved across standard Crown City social currency. The mayoral election, interest rates, the downtown construction traffic, surface-level exchanges that sounded like connection and functioned more like mutual surveillance. But Grant couldn't shake the sensation that everyone at the table was performing, working from a script he hadn't been given. There was a quality to the attention directed at him, something beneath the professional warmth that felt less like collegial interest and more like observation. "I heard the program tonight is supposed to be quite something," Pauline Vandermeer said, her jeweled fingers toying with the stem of her champagne flute with the careful control of someone managing more energy than her expression revealed. "The organizers have been terribly secretive about the details." "Probably another 20-minute video presentation," Richard said. "Last year they made us watch testimonials before we could eat." "I don't mind," Jennifer said calmly. "If sitting through a presentation helps kids who need it, I'll happily watch." "Spoken like someone whose contribution gets her name on a building wing." Thomas laughed. "It does," Jennifer confirmed, "and I earned it." The lights dimmed. A spotlight found the stage. Grant checked his watch, 8:45. They were running 15 minutes behind schedule, unusual for an event this meticulously managed. Something was off. He couldn't locate it. Then the main ballroom doors opened again and every head in the room turned. And Grant Holston, for the first time in years, felt something that was not quite fear, but was close enough to it that his body couldn't tell the difference. Vivien Hart walked in like weather, inevitable, total, and entirely indifferent to whether you were ready for it. His breath left him. He hadn't seen his wife in 3 days. He told her he was in Seattle for a conference, when in fact he'd been at the downtown apartment he kept under a shell corporation called Meridian Holdings LLC, with Lola and a bottle of wine, and the easy comfort of a life where nothing was required of him except to want things and take them. In those 3 days, Vivien appeared to have undergone a transformation so complete that for one disorienting second, he genuinely did not recognize her. She wore a gown of molten gold, deep burnished amber fabric that moved like liquid and caught every light in the chandelier-lit room. The Hart family jewels adorned her throat and wrists, emeralds and diamonds that had been on her grandmother's neck at her society debut in 1952. Pieces that appeared in insurance actuarial tables and museum records, and the kind of historic family photographs that ended up in coffee table books about Crown City's founding families. Her auburn hair was swept into an elegant chignon that showcased the architectural beauty of her face. High cheekbones, gray eyes with the quality of light that made you feel when they were directed at you that you were being read at speeds you weren't equipped to track. But more than any physical detail, it was her presence that altered the room. She moved with unhurried, absolute confidence, acknowledging greetings with the gracious nods of someone who had always expected to be greeted, her posture perfect, her expression serenely certain. She looked like royalty of the old variety, the kind that moved through rooms as if the rooms had been arranged around her. And at her side, walking with the easy familiarity of a trusted weapon, was Damon Klein. The ice started somewhere near Grant's heart and spread steadily outward. Damon Klein was Crown City's most feared corporate attorney. He did not handle divorces or personal grievances. He orchestrated hostile takeovers. He had spent 30 years defending executives in securities fraud trials and disassembling corporate structures that their architects had believed were impenetrable. His adversaries routinely chose surrender over combat, preferring settlement terms to whatever Damon Klein had prepared for them in a courtroom. He was 53, silver-haired, impeccably dressed, and possessed of a controlled intensity that made innocent people feel they should be reviewing their decisions. He was walking beside Vivien Hart like a nuclear option she had kept in reserve for exactly this occasion. "Oh my," Pauline Vandermeer breathed beside Grant, her champagne arrested halfway to her lips. "Is that Damon Klein?" "It is." Martin Chen confirmed, his voice tight with the recognition of a man who had personal experience. "I dealt with him during the Transit Authority restructuring. The man is absolutely ruthless." A pause. "What is he doing at a charity gala?" What indeed? Lola had gone very still beside Grant, all the easy warmth of the evening evacuated from her posture. "Grant," she whispered. "Who is that with her?" "My wife," he said. The words came out rougher than he intended, just two flat syllables that named a fact he was only beginning to understand the full weight of. The color left Lola's face in real time. "Your wife is here. You said she never comes to these things." "She doesn't," he said. Or hadn't. Or he had never noticed when she had. His eyes never left Vivien as she moved through the room, stopping to accept air kisses from women he had heard her mention at dinner parties for 20 years, shaking hands with men who smiled at her with the slightly over-warm attention of people who had always suspected she was more than her husband's wife, but had never been given sufficient evidence to say so publicly. She worked the space with the unhurried precision of someone who had always known exactly how to command a room, and had simply until tonight chosen not to demonstrate it. And then, with the inevitability of something long and carefully planned, Vivien turned and began walking directly toward table 3. Grant's mind ran through emergency responses. Denial. Misdirection. The charm offensive that had served him in 100 difficult negotiations. He could manage this. He had always managed situations like this. But Vivien arrived at the table before he could select his approach, and Damon Klein was there with her. And Grant understood in that moment, with the clarity of a man watching a machine he didn't build begin to run, that he was not managing anything tonight. "Grant," Vivien said warmly, exactly as she always sounded, melodious, composed, carrying the particular ease of someone who had never had to perform comfort because it was simply how she moved through the world. "What a lovely surprise. I wasn't sure you'd be back from Seattle in time." The trap was elegant. Acknowledge the Seattle lie, and he had to explain his presence. Pretend confusion about his own schedule, and he looked unstable. Every angle closed before he'd had time to find it. "Change of plans," he managed, rising with automatic courtesy. "Morning meetings were canceled. I flew back last night. I didn't want to wake you when I came in." "How considerate," Vivien said. Something moved through her eyes, a flash of dark, private amusement, precise as a scalpel gone before anyone else could catch it. "And you must be Lola Reyes." She turned to Lola with the full weight of her attention, and Lola clearly was not prepared for it. "I've heard so much about you." Lola stood on legs that had forgotten their purpose. Her practiced composure had simply vacated her. Mrs. Holston, I... It's nice to meet you. Please, call me Vivien. She smiled, and it was perfect, and it was terrifying. That dress is absolutely stunning. Marchesa, isn't it the fall collection? Yes, Lola managed. How did you... I have an eye for these things. Vivian's gaze moved over Lola with the calm efficiency of an appraiser who has already reached her conclusion and is simply noting the details for the record. And those earrings are lovely. Cartier. Lola's hand flew to her ear before she could stop it touching the diamonds, as if she needed to confirm by touch that they were the same objects they'd been an hour ago. Beautiful taste, Vivien said pleasantly. Then she turned to the table with the generous, encompassing warmth of a woman always glad to see everyone greeting the Vandermeers Jennifer, Thomas, and Martin by name, asking after specifics she had no reason to know unless she'd prepared carefully, which she clearly had. She introduced Damon Klein with the casual ease of someone introducing a colleague at a departmental meeting, her tone implying nothing and communicating everything. Well, Vivien said finally, her smile settling on Grant with an expression that looked from the outside like affection. We should find our seats. I have a feeling tonight is going to be quite memorable. A beat perfectly timed. Lola Grant, enjoy your evening. She swept toward the head table, Damon Klein following with the unhurried certainty of a man who has already made all the decisions that matter. They left behind a silence so complete that the string quartet seemed suddenly out of register, with reality playing something light and baroque into air that had been entirely rearranged. Thomas Wu spoke first. Did that just happen? That, Martin Chen said slowly, with the tone of a man synthesizing something deeply unnerving, was the most terrifying display of good manners I have ever witnessed. Grant reached for his water glass. He needed something to anchor him. Vivien knew about Lola. Of course she knew. She had probably known for months. He'd believed himself discreet, had believed it with the confidence of a man accustomed to being right, and had been catastrophically wrong. The question that turned his blood cold was not whether she knew. The question was what she had been doing with that knowledge during the months since she'd acquired it. Damon Klein, the Shell Corporation, the downtown apartment, her choice to come here tonight dressed like that with him at her shoulder. 7 months. She'd had 7 months. Grant, Lola's voice was barely above a whisper. I think I should leave. No, he said more sharply than he meant to. He moderated his tone as Jennifer glanced their way. If you leave now, it looks like we're running. Stay calm. We'll work something out afterward. Even as he said it, he didn't believe a word of it. Nothing about Vivien's entrance had suggested a woman preparing to negotiate. She had moved through this room like someone arriving at a conclusion, like a general surveying a battlefield after the outcome has already been decided, and what remains is simply the formality of making it official. At the head table, Vivien had taken the seat beside Eleanor Jameson. The two women leaned together in quiet conversation, Vivien listening with the focused attention of someone who genuinely cared. She looked utterly at ease, entirely in command, as if every detail of this evening had been arranged precisely as she'd intended. Because it had. Grant understood that now. His wife, his quiet, accommodating, thoroughly predictable wife, had planned every single moment of tonight. The lights dimmed further, a spotlight found the stage. Eleanor Jameson rose and approached the podium, her smile broad and genuine, the smile of someone who had built something real and was about to be pleasantly surprised. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Horizon Hope Gala. Her voice carried cleanly. Thank you all for being here and for your continued support of our mission. This year, we've helped over 300 young people find stable housing and job training. We could not do this work without you. Polite applause. Grant barely heard it. Before we begin the main program, Eleanor continued, I am delighted to announce a very special contribution that came to us just this afternoon. She paused, and the quality of that pause deliberate waited sent something cold through Grant's chest. One of our longtime supporters has made a decision that will change the trajectory of this organization and the lives of hundreds of young people. And she has asked to announce it personally. Eleanor stepped back from the podium. Please welcome to the stage Vivien Hart. The applause was immediate, enthusiastic, the kind that comes when 300 people simultaneously recalibrate their understanding of someone they thought they knew. Grant heard it from inside a rushing silence, like a man standing in the eye of something very large and very fast. Vivien rose from her seat with fluid, unhurried grace. She walked to the podium, accepted the microphone from Eleanor with genuine warmth, turned to face the room, and waited for the applause to subside with the assured timing of someone who had always known exactly when a room would go quiet for her. "Thank you, Eleanor," she began. Her voice was clear and steady and filled the room without effort. "And thank you all for being here. I've supported Horizon Hope since its founding 12 years ago because I believe very simply that every young person deserves a safe place to sleep a path forward and adults who refuse to give up on them. The work Eleanor and her team do literally saves lives." More applause. Grant's hands tightened on the edge of the table. "Tonight," Vivien continued, "I am honored to announce a donation of $5 million to Horizon Hope to fund the opening of the Northside facility and to establish a permanent endowment for their job training programs." The ballroom erupted. $5 million. The number moved through the crowd like electricity. Heads turned, expressions recalibrated, and Grant watched in real time as Crown City's elite revised their understanding of exactly who Vivien Hart was. His mind was doing its own arithmetic. $5 million, their joint accounts, didn't hold anything near that in liquid capital. She had liquidated something. Stocks from the Hart Family Trust. Bonds. Real estate holdings. But how had she done it without triggering the oversight provisions he'd insisted on in their prenuptial agreement, the provision that gave him authority over her inherited wealth in exchange for her receiving shares in Holston Industries? Shares she controlled. Shares that... The realization arrived like a cold hand at the back of his neck. He had given her shares, and he had never, not once in 23 years, thought to ask what she'd been doing with them. This donation, Vivien said, her voice cutting through the roar in his head, was inspired by someone who taught me an important lesson about honesty. Someone who showed me quite clearly that I had been living a lie, and that the truth, however painful, is infinitely preferable to comfortable deception. The ballroom quieted. Something had changed in the quality of her voice. Something beneath the warmth had surfaced, or rather the warmth had not disappeared but had been joined by something that had been there all along and was choosing now to become visible. 300 people leaned almost imperceptibly forward, collective breath held without anyone deciding to hold it. "Lola Reyes," Vivien said. Her gaze left the middle distance and found table 3 with the accuracy of a woman who had known all evening exactly where Lola was sitting. "Would you please join me on stage?" The silence that followed was total. Lola's face had gone the color of chalk. Around table 3, the expressions of Grant's tablemates moved through a spectrum from stunned disbelief to the barely suppressed electricity of people watching a social disaster of historic proportion unfold from the absolute best possible seats in the room. "Go on," Vivien encouraged from the stage, her smile as warm and unchanging as something very carefully constructed. "Don't be shy." 300 heads swiveled to table 3. Lola looked at Grant with eyes asking a question he had no answer to. "What do I do? What do I do?" He had nothing. No move, no angle, no version of his particular genius for maneuvering that applied to this moment in any useful way. Refusing would be confession. Going up might give him some slim theoretical chance to contain what happened next. "It's fine," he heard himself say. "Go up there." He would spend a very long time afterward thinking about those 3 words. Lola rose on legs that were not quite steady, and the crimson dress that had been so triumphant an hour ago now marked her the way targets are marked, visibly, unavoidably, for everyone present to track. The walk to the stage could not have been more than 30 seconds. It felt like a procession. She climbed the steps. Vivien greeted her with warm hands and a smile that could have passed for genuine affection, taking Lola's arm with the gentle authority of a woman, making absolutely sure she couldn't run. "Thank you for joining me," Vivien said, her voice amplified and crystalline through the ballroom's sound system reaching every corner of every table. "I wanted you here because you played such a crucial role in helping me see clearly." She paused, the pause of a woman who understands that silence at the right moment is the loudest thing in a room. For the past 7 months, Vivien said, Lola has been having an affair with my husband. The intake of breath was collective and audible. It moved through the room like something physical. Lola made a small wounded sound that the microphone caught and broadcast to every person present. At table 3, Pauline Vandermeer's hand flew to her mouth. Thomas Wu's glass stopped halfway to his lips. Martin Chen went very, very still. Grant Holston did not move. He sat exactly as he was, both hands flat on the table, and the only evidence that anything had changed was the slight blanching at the edges of his mouth, the betrayal of a body registering catastrophic threat, while the mind was still insisting on control. I've known for quite some time, Vivien continued, and her voice had not changed. Still warm, still steady, still carrying the unhurried confidence of a woman who has been working toward this exact sentence for 7 months and is pleased finally to have reached it. Grant isn't nearly as clever as he thinks he is, she smiled. The shell corporation for the apartment downtown I serve on the board of the bank that approved the lease. The business trips to Seattle, his assistant sends me his actual calendar. She let that settle. She's a lovely woman named Patricia. She's worked for me for 15 years and only started working for Grant because I placed her there. The room tilted. Patricia, his competent, perfectly professional assistant, who handled his schedule, his travel, his correspondence, who had been reporting to Vivien from the beginning. He had built his entire deception on a foundation that his wife had constructed herself and tended patiently for 7 months, watching him walk through it every day. At first, Vivien said, I was devastated. 23 years of marriage, and it came to this. Something beneath her composed surface shifted, not breaking through, but becoming visible like the shape of bedrock seen through water. I cried. I raged. I considered the obvious options: confront him privately, file for divorce, pretend I didn't know, and live in polite fiction. She shook her head once with the calm finality of someone rejecting things that no longer serve any purpose. But then I realized something important. I didn't want to confront Grant in private, where he could spin it and manipulate it and make promises he'd never keep. I didn't want a quiet divorce where we'd both perform civility while lawyers divided assets. And I was done, entirely and permanently done, pretending to be blind to something that everyone in this room probably suspected. Guilty glances flickered across the ballroom. She was right, and the people who had suspected and said nothing now wore that silence on their faces like a kind of complicity. So instead, Vivien said, and her voice had steadied into something that was not warm and not cold, but was entirely, absolutely certain, I decided to do something I have never done in 23 years of marriage. She found Grant at table 3, across the room, across 300 people holding their breath, across the distance between what his life had been this morning and what it was already becoming. Tell the complete truth, she said, publicly, and let the consequences fall where they may. She held his gaze. Grant, darling, Vivien said, you should probably pay attention to this next part. Additional interior passage. Grant's perspective deepens before the revelation. The thing about Grant Holston was that he had never learned to be afraid of his own decisions. In 30 years of aggressive business practice, he'd made choices that other men would have spent weeks agonizing over and executed them by Friday. He'd acquired distressed properties, forced partners, out of deals, leveraged relationships to close transactions that existed on the edge of what the law technically permitted. He had always moved forward. He had always prevailed. He had crucially always been the architect of whatever happened next. Sitting at table 3, watching his wife approach the podium, he was experiencing for the first time in decades the particular horror of being inside someone else's plan, of having been inside it for months without knowing it, of understanding that every move he'd made, every lie he'd told, every transaction he'd run through the shell corporation, every weekend he'd spent at the downtown apartment while Vivien graciously covered for him, had been not an act of freedom, but a piece of evidence that his wife had been quietly, patiently filing away. He thought about Patricia, his perfectly professional, utterly reliable assistant of 3 years, the woman he had trusted with his schedule, his travel, the precise geography of his private life. She had been Vivien since the beginning, not stolen, not turned placed, installed. A human surveillance system running silently in the center of his operation, feeding data back to a woman he had stopped considering a player in his world at all. That was the thing that made his jaw clench and his vision narrow at the edges. Not the betrayal exactly, but the assumption. His assumption so fundamental he had never once examined it, that Vivien was not, had never been someone who would take independent action in her own interest, that she would absorb whatever he gave her and accommodate it, and continue reliably to perform the role he had cast her in supportive wife, gracious hostess Hart. Family name attached to Holston Industries' prestige. He had been wrong. The question that was eating through his certainty like acid, now the question that had arrived the moment Damon Klein walked through that ballroom door, was how wrong he had been, and in how many dimensions. Across the table, Pauline Vandermeer caught her husband's eye, with the small, silent communication of two people who have been married long enough to have a private vocabulary. Richard gave an almost imperceptible nod. Martin Chen had his phone in his lap under the table, checking something or possibly recording. Grant couldn't tell and found he couldn't spare the attention to investigate. He was watching Vivien stand at that podium and begin to announce a $5 million donation, and he was thinking about the Hart Family Trust, about the shares he'd given her, about the prenuptial agreement he'd designed to protect himself, and which he was beginning to understand had been designed to protect him only up to the moment Vivien chose to use it differently. $5 million. She had done something with that trust that he hadn't tracked. She had liquidated positions he'd dismissed as decorative old family wealth that sat in bonds, and family real estate, and private equity arrangements dating back 2 generations before either of them was born. He had always thought of Vivien's family money as static, the kind of wealth that existed to be inherited and displayed rather than actively managed. He had been wrong about that too. And the shares. She held 18% of Holston Industries placed there by the prenuptial agreement as a kind of compensation for the oversight provisions, a gesture that had felt when he'd made it like generosity, like throwing a bone. He'd never asked what she did with those shares, never inquired about whether she'd been in contact with other shareholders, never once thought to wonder what might happen if his accommodating background scenery wife decided that 18% was a starting point rather than a ceiling. The ballroom erupted around him when Vivien announced the $5 million, and Grant sat in the center of the noise like a man in freefall who hasn't yet registered the ground coming up. He heard the applause as if from a great distance. He watched Lola go rigid beside him, her champagne glass abandoned, both hands folded in her lap, with the careful stillness of someone trying very hard to appear calm. At the head table, Vivien waited for the room to settle with the composed patience of a woman who understood that she had timed everything correctly and could afford to wait. And when the room finally quieted and Vivien said the words that changed everything, said them with the warmth and the steadiness of someone who had rehearsed this, until it was as natural as breathing, Grant understood that this had never been a moment of impulse or emotion. This was the conclusion of something that had been in motion for 7 months. This was Vivien Hart finally deciding to take up space. For the past 7 months, she said into the crystalline silence of 300 people holding their breath, Lola has been having an affair with my husband. And the room changed. Irreversibly, collectively, permanently changed. Grant could feel the social ground shifting beneath the table, beneath the cream silk, beneath the marble floors of the Celestia Grand, the entire structure of his world in Crown City, beginning its long, slow, carefully choreographed fall. He sat with both hands flat on the table and did not move. And in the terrible quiet that followed, with Lola pale and trembling on the stage, and 300 pairs of eyes moving between his wife and his table like spectators at a match, where the outcome was already decided, Grant Holston finally understood something that it had taken him 52 years and a public catastrophe to learn. He had never been the most dangerous person in his own marriage. He had simply catastrophically failed to notice the one who was. Grant's hands were still flat on the table when Vivien reached the part of her speech that the entire room had been waiting for without knowing it. She stood at the podium in the molten gold gown with the Hart family emeralds at her throat, and she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had decided after 23 years of careful accommodation that she was finished accommodating. The shift in the room was palpable. Something that had been held in careful suspension had been released, and 300 people were collectively recalibrating their understanding of the evening they were attending. "I want to be clear about something," Vivien said, her voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom, with the precision of someone who had chosen her words with the same care she'd chosen everything else about tonight. "I'm not doing this out of spite. I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing this because I spent 23 years making myself smaller, quieter, more convenient, more accommodating for a man who mistook my grace for weakness." She paused. The room was so quiet that the sound of Lola's shuddering breath could be heard by the people at the nearest tables. "I organized his life," Vivien continued, her tone still conversational, still warm warmth that had somehow become the most dangerous quality in the room. "I raised his professional profile. I opened doors he could never have accessed on his own. I brought the Hart family name and everything it represented to a marriage that desperately needed what I had to offer. And Grant repaid that by lying to me systematically, deliberately, without remorse every single day for 7 months." At table 3, Pauline Vandermeer had stopped pretending not to be transfixed. Her champagne flute sat untouched. Richard was watching Vivien with the expression of a man witnessing something he will describe to people for the rest of his life. Thomas Wu had turned fully in his chair to face the stage. Even Jennifer Park, who had seen any number of things in her career as an architect navigating a predominantly male industry, wore an expression of focused, quiet attention that suggested she recognized what she was watching. Martin Chen notably had both hands above the table. "So tonight," Vivien said, "I'm filing for divorce." She let the sentence land the way she'd planned it to land, cleanly, without softening, without apology. "The papers were submitted to the courthouse at 5 o'clock this afternoon." And then Damon Klein rose from his seat at the head table. He moved with the unhurried precision of a man who had spent 30 years understanding that nothing is more effective in a high-stakes situation than absolute calm. He carried a slim leather briefcase that no one had noticed until this moment, and he joined Vivien at the podium with the bearing of a man stepping onto very familiar ground. "The divorce filing is comprehensive," Damon said, his voice devoid of inflection, the tone of a surgeon explaining a procedure, relevant facts delivered in sequence, the patient's comfort a secondary consideration to accuracy. "But that is actually the least interesting aspect of tonight's announcement." Grant's jaw locked. "Holston Industries," Damon continued, opening the folder with the practiced efficiency of someone who has rehearsed this moment, "is structured as a privately held corporation. Grant holds 42% of shares. Under the prenuptial agreement, the briefest pause, clinical acknowledgement of Grant's own instrument being used against him, Vivien holds 18%. The remaining 40% has historically been distributed among various investors and silent partners." He looked up from the folder. Not at Grant. Across the room, at no one in particular, the gaze of a man presenting facts to the public record rather than to any individual. "Over the past 6 months, Damon said, Vivien has systematically acquired those outstanding shares through a series of private transactions." Another pause. In that pause, 300 people did the arithmetic. "She now controls 51% of Holston Industries. As of tomorrow morning, when the share transfer documents are filed with the state, Vivien Hart becomes the majority shareholder and controlling interest of her soon-to-be ex-husband's company." The ballroom did not erupt. It did something more interesting. It went very, very still. The particular stillness of people processing information of such magnitude that the usual social noise momentarily failed to generate. Then the murmurs began. And they built quickly. Grant stood up. His chair scraped against the marble floor with a sound that cut through the room. He stood without having decided to stand, his body making a decision that his mind was still too far behind to ratify, and the sound brought every remaining gaze in the room swinging to table 3. "This is insane," he said. His voice came out with more authority than he felt the long-practiced carrying tone of a man accustomed to commanding rooms. "Vivien, if you want to discuss our marriage, if you have concerns, legitimate grievances, we can do that. Privately, like adults. But making wild accusations in a public forum, dragging business matters into a personal situation, this is not—" "Sit down, Grant." Vivien's voice cut through his with the quiet, absolute authority of someone who has decided that she is finished being interrupted. He stopped. In 23 years of marriage, she had never spoken to him that way. She had disagreed with him. She had occasionally argued with him. but she had never wielded her voice like an instrument, never spoken with that particular quality of command, the kind that didn't ask and didn't negotiate and left no room for anything except compliance. He found himself hesitating, actually hesitating. And in that hesitation, in the 3 seconds of visible uncertainty, that Table 3 witnessed something had already changed. "I'm not finished," Vivien said. She turned back to the room. "I have documentation." She produced her phone from somewhere Grant hadn't noticed the gesture, fluid and unhurried, as if she'd done it 100 times in practice. Bank statements, credit card receipts, text messages, emails, all acquired legally, and I want to emphasize that because I did nothing to obtain any of this information that I was not fully entitled to do as a co-owner of our joint accounts, and as of 6 months ago, as a majority shareholder in Holston Industries. She swiped the screen. "Grant to Lola," she said. The ballroom's sound system carried her voice to every corner. "March 15th. Vivien's at some charity luncheon today. I told her I have back-to-back meetings until 8. We have the whole afternoon. Wear that black thing I like." Lola made a sound, a small strangled sound. The mascara that had been so elegant an hour ago was beginning to run. "April 2nd, Vivien continued. "Just signed the lease on the apartment. 2 bedrooms, river view all hours. Vivien thinks I'm investing in a commercial property. She's too busy with her little committees to ask questions." Little committees. The phrase had clearly been intended as mockery. Here delivered by Vivien in front of 300 of Crown City's most prominent citizens, it landed like an indictment. Several women at nearby tables had gone very quiet in the way of people who recognized a particular contempt, the contempt of a man for a wife's serious work reframed as adorable busyness. "May 21st, Vivien said. "Vivien." She scrolled without looking at the phone. She had memorized the dates. "I feel bad sometimes. She seems nice. Does she really not know?" She paused briefly, and the room waited. "She knows what I let her know. Vivien spent our whole marriage living in a fantasy world where everything is perfect and proper. She wouldn't recognize reality if it hit her in the face. Besides, she's got everything she wants, the house, the status, the Hart family name on everything she does. She's not going anywhere." The words hung in the air. In the terrible silence that followed, Grant experienced something he had not felt since his father's bankruptcy, the sensation of a foundation giving way beneath his feet. Not the metaphorical foundation of his confidence or his narrative, but something more structural, the specific collapse of a man realizing that what he thought was private has always been public and that the audience has been waiting. "Should I keep going?" Vivien asked pleasantly. "Because I have months of this. Messages documenting exactly how little respect Grant had for me for this marriage, and if we're being honest, for the truth in any context in which the truth was inconvenient." "Vivien." Grant's voice came out without the authority he'd intended. Something raw had gotten into it. "Please, I've made mistakes. I know that. But you don't have to do this. Not here. Not in front of... Don't have to." She tilted her head, studying him with the calm interest of someone encountering an argument they've already considered and set aside. "Grant, I've been doing things I didn't have to do for 23 years. I organized your life. I made your introductions. I absorbed your indifference and called it a marriage." She paused. "What I don't have to do, it turns out, is any of that anymore." She handed her phone to Damon, who accepted it with the seamless efficiency of someone who had always known he would be handed it at exactly this moment. "The financial impact," Damon said, returning to the folder, "extends beyond the affair expenses, which total approximately $380,000 over 7 months drawn from joint accounts and company funds. Grant has also been manipulating company finances to inflate his personal compensation while minimizing distributions to other shareholders, including Vivien." He turned a page. "We have documented approximately $1.2 million in irregular transactions over the past 3 years. Add the tax implications of his shell corporation activities, and we are looking at potential criminal exposure for fraud and tax evasion." Potential criminal exposure. The phrase was delivered in the same flat clinical tone as everything else Damon had said, and it landed with considerably more force because of that neutrality. Criminal exposure, not accusation documentation, not allegation paperwork already submitted. Senator Michaels, who had been married to the same woman for 40 years and whose political career depended on the kind of family values image that required its practitioners to maintain, at minimum, the performance of moral consistency, was watching the stage with an expression of unmistakable attention. Grant sat back down. He didn't decide to. His legs simply determined that standing was no longer viable. "I want to address something directly," Vivien said, reclaiming the center of the stage, with a calm that had by now moved beyond composed and into something else entirely, something that wasn't coldness exactly, but was its functional equivalent. "I know what you're all thinking, that this is vindictive, that this is personal, that a woman scorned, etc." She shook her head slowly with the measured patience of someone setting a record straight for the final time. "I'm not interested in destroying Grant for the sake of destruction. I'm interested in accountability. I'm interested in ensuring that he cannot do this to anyone else. And I'm interested if I'm being fully transparent in making absolutely certain that he cannot spin this into something I am responsible for." She turned to look at him across the room, not with anger, not with grief, with something that was harder to categorize than either the clear level regard of a woman who has finished being afraid of what a man thinks of her. "Grant," she said, "here is what happens next." The ballroom held its breath. "Option 1, you accept the divorce terms that Damon will present to you tonight. You retain 25% of Holston Industries, enough to remain wealthy, not enough to maintain control. You sign a confession detailing the financial improprieties, which will be held in escrow and released to authorities only if you contest the divorce or attempt to retaliate. You agree to a non-disparagement clause, a 5-year ban on direct contact with me, except through attorneys, and a quiet exit from public life." She paused. "Option 2, you fight me. You contest the divorce challenge. The share transfers make this ugly in court, and I will bury you." She said it without heat, which made it considerably more credible than anger would have. "I will release every message, every receipt, every piece of documentation to the press. I will pursue criminal charges for the fraud and the embezzlement. I will make certain that every business deal you have ever conducted gets audited, every relationship gets scrutinized, every secret gets light. I will spend every dollar of the Hart family fortune, if necessary, to ensure that you become a cautionary tale told in business schools about what happens when arrogance meets accountability." The threat was absolute. 300 people heard it and understood with the collective certainty of people who had all personally dealt with Damon Klein's reputation that she was not bluffing. "You have until midnight tonight to decide," Vivien said. "Damon will be at the bar with the paperwork. Find him before the clock strikes 12. Sign the documents, and you get option 1, a quiet exit with your dignity mostly intact and enough money to live very comfortably for the rest of your life." She turned to Lola on stage beside her. "As for you, Lola," her voice shifted, not warmer exactly, but less prosecutorial, "you have a choice as well. Cooperate with my attorneys, provide testimony, confirm the timeline and the financial arrangements. Do that honestly and completely, and I will make sure your career survives this." She let a brief silence establish itself. "Or stay loyal to Grant, and I will make certain that everyone in Crown City knows exactly what kind of judgment you demonstrated when you decided that a married man's assessment of his own marriage was reliable information." Lola nodded. She had been nodding for the last 30 seconds in the frantic automatic way of someone whose survival instincts have taken over entirely from any other cognitive function. Tears had cut 2 tracks through her makeup. "I'll cooperate," she whispered, the microphone catching every syllable. "I'll tell you everything. I'm so sorry, I never meant to—" "What matters now?" Vivien said, not unkindly, but with a finality that closed the door on the apology before it could be completed. "Is what you do next. Damon will arrange a meeting." She gestured toward the stage steps with the polite authority of someone managing a departure. "Be honest, be complete, and you may salvage something from this." Lola descended the steps in the shaking, rapid way of someone who has been holding themselves upright through will alone and can feel that will beginning to give way. She moved through the tables toward the ballroom exit without looking at Grant, without looking at anyone, her crimson dress parting the crowd like something that had been stained and needed to get away from whatever had caused it. The sound of her heels on marble echoed until the doors swung shut behind her and she was gone. Vivien stood alone at the podium. The spotlight caught the emeralds at her throat, and they flashed green fire, and she looked exactly like what she had always been, and what no one in this room had adequately accounted for a woman with the resources, the intelligence, and now the will to use both. "I know what you're all thinking," she said, and her voice had settled into something quieter, more direct, as if the public address portion of the evening was complete, and she was now simply talking to 300 people she happened to know. "This is messy. This is uncomfortable. This isn't how things are done in polite society. We're supposed to handle our private disasters privately, smile in public, and pretend everything is fine even when it is falling apart." She shook her head. "I'm done pretending. I'm done protecting men who don't deserve protection. I'm done caring more about appearances than about truth." She paused. "Grant didn't just betray me. He bet that I would care more about avoiding embarrassment than seeking justice. He counted on my desire to maintain our standing. He was wrong." Senator Michaels stood up first. It was a slow, deliberate movement. The movement of a man deciding that something he is witnessing warrants a particular response regardless of the social complexity of making it. He began to applaud. Slowly. Then Jennifer Park stood. Then Pauline Vandermeer. Then Thomas Wu. Then Martin Chen. And the standing ovation moved through the ballroom like a tide until 300 people were on their feet in the chandelier-lit room, applauding Vivien Hart with the unambiguous energy of people who had been waiting without knowing it to see exactly this. Grant remained seated. He sat while the ballroom stood and applauded the public dismantling of his reputation, and he understood with the strange, disconnected clarity of a man in shock that he could do nothing. That standing to object would only make it worse. That he had somewhere along the way used up every move available to him and arrived at the end of the board with nothing left to play. The applause subsided eventually. Vivien accepted it with a brief nod. The dignified acknowledgement of someone receiving something they felt was appropriate rather than flattering, and then impossibly did something that made her position in the room permanent and irrevocable. "Thank you all," she said. "Now I believe Eleanor has a wonderful program planned. I don't want my personal matters to overshadow the real purpose of tonight, which is the young people Horizon Hope serves." And with that, with the elegant, deliberate act of subordinating her own dramatic triumph to the charity event, she'd transformed it from. Vivien stepped back from the podium and returned to her seat, and the evening resumed around her as if it hadn't just been completely rearranged. Grant stood on legs that felt uncertain beneath him. He couldn't sit through dinner. He couldn't perform sociability while 300 people processed what they'd just witnessed and began the process of deciding what it meant for their relationships with him. He pulled out his phone and texted his driver with the mechanical efficiency of a man operating on procedures because cognition has temporarily gone offline. "Grant." Pauline Vandermeer's voice, carefully neutral, reached him as he moved to gather himself. "If you need to leave, I'm sure everyone would understand." It was the closest thing to kindness anyone at the table was going to offer, and both of them knew it. He nodded once, not trusting his voice, and made his way to the ballroom exit with the awareness of every gaze tracking his movement and every whispered conversation that started up in his wake. The lobby of the Celestia Grand was a relief after the concentrated pressure of the ballroom open space and marble and the absence of 300 pairs of eyes. Grant loosened his bow tie. He needed air. He needed to think. He needed, for the first time in his adult life, a strategy for a situation he hadn't created and could not control. "Mr. Holston." He turned. Damon Klein had materialized from the ballroom with the unhurried inevitability of a glacier folder in hand, briefcase at his side, expression professionally empty of anything except efficiency. "I have the papers here," Damon said, approaching with calm, measured steps. "If you'd like to review them now, I've reserved a conference room just off the main lobby. We can discuss terms." "She gave me until midnight," Grant said. His voice came out raw around the edges. "She did," Damon agreed. "But every minute you wait is a minute spent knowing what's coming rather than having made a decision about it. Most people find the uncertainty more painful than the outcome." He paused. "I'm offering you the opportunity to end this tonight. To start building whatever comes next rather than standing in the lobby of a hotel at which you are no longer welcome." Grant wanted to tell him to go to hell, wanted to reject everything the offer, the timeline, the entire framework of a negotiation he hadn't agreed to enter. He was a man who had never accepted terms he hadn't set, who had built his career on ensuring that he was always in every dealing the one holding the leverage. But Damon was right. He was standing in the lobby, tie loose, the sounds of the gala continuing behind him, continuing without him, the world having already moved on to the next course and the next auction item and the next conversation. The uncertainty of what came next if he refused was genuinely worse than anything a signed document could contain. "Where?" he said. Damon gestured toward a door off the main lobby. "In there. I took the liberty of reserving it for the evening." Of course he had. Vivien and her attorney had anticipated every move he might make and had already prepared the room. The conference room was elegantly appointed in the Celestia Grand's understated style leather chairs, mahogany table, abstract art that probably cost more than most people's cars selected to project refined neutrality. Damon spread the documents across the table with practiced efficiency, turning each page so Grant could read without having to ask. Grant read. The divorce settlement was exactly as Vivien had described 25% of Holston Industries, the financial confession held in escrow, the non-disparagement agreement, the 5-year contact restriction, access to shared assets during the transition period supervised and logged. The loss of the Riverside mansion, which was to go to Vivien as part of the asset division, a detail that Grant had not fully absorbed during the speech, but which arrived now with the weight of permanence. His house, his study, the bar cart with the 30-year-old scotch. None of it his anymore. "There's an addendum," Damon said, turning to a final page. "Vivien is willing to structure the payout of your share value over 3 years rather than requiring immediate liquidation. It will minimize the tax impact and allow you to maintain your lifestyle during the transition. She's also agreed not to pursue criminal charges for the financial improprieties," Damon added, "provided you cooperate fully with the divorce and the share transfer." "How generous," Grant said. The words tasted like ash. "It is actually," Damon replied without a trace of irony, "she could bury you completely. She has chosen not to. I would suggest you appreciate the distinction." Grant picked up the pen Damon had placed on the table, heavy, expensive, the kind of pen that signed documents that changed lives. He stared at the signature line. "If I sign this," he said slowly, "what happens to the company Vivien doesn't know how to run a real estate development empire?" Something moved across Damon's expression. Not offense, something closer to the weary patience of a man who had expected this particular argument and had prepared for it but found it tiresome nonetheless. "Mr. Holston," he said, "Vivien holds a degree in economics from Harvard. She serves on the boards of 4 major corporations. She has managed a charitable foundation with an endowment of over $30 million for the past decade. Her committees, the ones you characterized in your text messages as hobbies, suitable for keeping a board wife occupied, have taught her more about organizational management, stakeholder relations, and strategic planning than you appear to have absorbed in 20 years of running Holston Industries." The rebuke landed with surgical precision. Grant had never asked what Vivien did on the days he wasn't home, had never inquired about the board seats she held, or the organizations she advised, or the specific mechanics of running a foundation that distributed $30 million with documented effectiveness year after year. He had dismissed it all as social decoration-appropriate activity for a CEO's wife, not worthy of serious professional regard. He had underestimated her in every possible dimension. Grant signed. The signature looked strange on the page, shaky in a way his handwriting never was, as if his hand understood this was surrender, even while his mind was still refusing to fully process it. There were more documents after the first: a financial confession, the non-disparagement agreement, the contact restriction agreement, the share transfer authorization, which required initials in 3 places. It took 20 minutes to work through all of it, 20 minutes to legally dismantle 23 years of marriage and hand over the majority control of everything he'd built. When it was done, Damon collected the documents, returned them to his folder with the same efficiency with which he'd presented them, and stood. "The divorce will be finalized in 60 days per state law," he said. "My office will handle all communications. Do not contact Vivien directly. Do not go to the house. Your personal belongings will be packed and delivered to whatever address you provide by end of week. Do not attempt to access joint accounts or company resources except as explicitly outlined in the settlement. Any violation of these terms will trigger the release of the confession and potential criminal prosecution. He paused. Are we clear set? Crystal, Grant said. The word came out hollow. Damon nodded once and left the conference room, taking with him the last functional piece of Grant's old life. Grant sat alone in the leather chair, listening to the muffled sounds of the gala continuing through the walls. He could hear faintly the sound of music and applause and conversation. The entirely ordinary sounds of 300 people having an evening adjusted now around the spectacle of his destruction and continuing regardless. Crown City kept moving. The world kept moving. The gala kept moving. Only Grant Holston had been stopped. His phone buzzed with a text from his driver. Ready out front, sir. Grant straightened his jacket out of long-established reflex and walked out of the Celestia Grand Hotel, past the gleaming lobby and through doors held open by staff who had witnessed his public humiliation and were too professional to let their expressions say so. Into the night air that felt cold despite the lingering warmth of the season. The car ride to the Riverside mansion, which was no longer his, though the papers making that official wouldn't be filed until morning, passed in silence. Grant stared out the window at Crown City's skyline. Buildings with his name on them caught the light from the streets below. Developments he had championed, deals. He had closed the physical evidence of 30 years of refusing to be told he couldn't. None of it looked the same as it had when he'd driven to the Celestia Grand this evening. The buildings were the same. He was the one who had changed, or rather had been changed by someone else's plan, which was a completely novel experience. The house was lit when they arrived. Vivien must have come and gone already, or sent someone ahead, or simply left the lights on with the casual authority of a woman who understood that the house was already effectively hers. He went inside. He walked through rooms that felt like a museum of his own life. The kitchen where their longtime housekeeper had made him breakfast every morning for 15 years. The formal dining room where they'd hosted dinner parties for people who were probably at this very moment discussing his downfall between courses of whatever was being served at table 2. The study, his study with the bar cart and the 30-year scotch, and the window overlooking the manicured garden. He poured a glass without sitting down and stood at the window drinking it, looking out at the garden Vivien had designed and maintained, and which had always been more hers than his by every measure except the deed. His phone buzzed. A text from a number he didn't recognize. Documents have been filed as of 9:47 p.m. You are legally separated from Vivien Hart, and share transfers will process tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. Congratulations on your new beginning. D.K. Grant read it twice. New beginning, as if this were something to celebrate, as if the systematic destruction of everything he had built and everything he had been could be reframed by a 2-word phrase at the end of a legal notification text into the opening chapter of something positive. He put the phone face down on the windowsill and finished the scotch. Somewhere in Crown City tonight, Vivien Hart was moving through whatever came next for her with the same prepared certainty she'd moved through everything else. She had done what she planned to do, and it had worked exactly as she'd designed it to work, and now she was on to the next thing, which was the rest of her life lived on her terms by her choices in the full light of who she'd always been. He poured a second glass, and in the quiet of the study that would soon belong to someone else, Grant Holston began slowly, reluctantly, and with no particular grace, the process of understanding that the most devastating thing Vivien had done to him tonight was not the public humiliation or the share transfer or the divorce filing. It was showing him with surgical clarity how thoroughly he had failed to see her, and how much that blindness had cost them both. He was still at the window, third glass. Now the garden dark beyond the glass when his phone began to fill with messages. The first few arrived in quick succession. Business associates with carefully worded expressions of sympathy that couldn't quite conceal the schadenfreude underneath the slight electrical charge in messages from people who had always at some level wanted to see Grant Holston brought to something equivalent to their own scale. Then came the people he'd considered friends. A golf partner citing an upcoming schedule conflict, a lunch regular suddenly unavailable for the foreseeable future, a bored acquaintance who wished him well in terms that sounded like an obituary. The social exile had already begun. His phone lit with the Crown City Chronicles Society reporter's Twitter thread. breaking most spectacular public divorce announcement in Crown City history. Vivien Hart just systematically dismantled her cheating husband Grant Holston at the Horizon Hope Gala. Thread follows. Someone had posted a shaky video from inside the ballroom. Vivien's voice clear and steady, and without a tremor in it, reading those text messages aloud to 300 silent people. Grant watched it with the detached horror of a man watching footage of his own accident, unable to look away and unable to do anything about what he was seeing. By the time the thread had accumulated thousands of shares, it was past 11. The story had already moved beyond Crown City, picked up by 2 national entertainment news outlets and 1 business publication that had clearly been monitoring Holston Industries since the ownership filing pinged their alerts. Grant turned the phone face down again. He made his way upstairs to the master bedroom, half expecting to find Vivien's closet emptied some physical evidence of departure, but everything remained exactly as it had been that morning. Her clothes organized by color and season with the precision she brought to everything. Her vanity displaying the jewelry she didn't consider special enough for the safe. A photograph on her nightstand, the 2 of them at their 10th anniversary party, smiling the smiles of people who had once believed they were going somewhere together. He picked up the frame. He looked at the people in it for a long time. The Grant in the photograph was 41, still hungry, still climbing, but not yet completely consumed by the particular vertigo of his own success. The Vivien was 37, her smile genuine in the photograph, her eyes holding that quality of warmth he had stopped noticing so gradually that he couldn't identify the moment it had gone. When had it changed? When had the warmth in her eyes been replaced by the polite, pleasant distance he'd spent years not noticing? When had she stopped reaching for him? When had their conversations about anything real ceased, replaced entirely by the logistics of maintaining a shared address and a shared public presence? The answer Grant suspected was that he had stopped noticing the signals long before she had stopped sending them. That she had been trying for years in the quiet ways available to a woman whose husband had stopped paying attention, and that she had eventually stopped trying not because she gave up on their marriage, but because she had finished grieving it and moved on to planning what came next. He set the photograph back down carefully. He moved to his own closet and pulled out a suitcase on autopilot, the mechanical motion of a man whose thinking mind has gone briefly offline and left his hands to manage the logistics. Suits, shirts, the basics. He packed without selecting, without considering what he was choosing or what he was leaving behind the way you pack when you understand that the destination matters less than getting gone. When the suitcase was ready, he went back to the study. He sat at his desk and opened his email, and found in his inbox a message from hart.personal@heartmail.com that had arrived 40 minutes ago. He stared at the sender address for a long moment. Then he opened it. Grant. By the time you read this, the documents will be filed and our legal separation will be official. I want you to understand that nothing I did tonight was impulsive. I've been planning this for 7 months, and every decision was made with full awareness of what it would cost both of us. I'm not writing to gloat. I'm not writing to continue hurting you. I'm writing because I want you to know something important. I didn't do this because I hate you. I did it because I finally loved myself more than I feared being alone. You taught me many things during our marriage, including how to identify weakness and exploit it strategically. You just never imagined I would use those skills against you. I hope you find whatever you're looking for in whatever comes next. I genuinely mean that, but you need to understand that you will never find it by making someone else smaller to make yourself feel bigger. That is the lesson here if you're capable of learning it. Take care of yourself, Grant. This is goodbye. V. He read it 3 times. He was looking for subtext, for hidden meaning, for anything beneath the plain surface of the words that might change their import or soften their edges. There was nothing to find. Vivien had said exactly what she meant with the same clarity and directness she'd brought to dismantling him at the Celestia Grand. She didn't hate him. She had simply finally decided that she was worth more than what she'd been getting, and she'd spent 7 months building the machinery to act on that decision. Grant closed the email without responding. He sat at his desk until the study began to lighten with the approach of dawn, 3 glasses of scotch and a rearranged life, and the silence of a house that had never quite been a home, not in the way homes were supposed to be, which was something he was only beginning to understand now that he was being asked to leave it. At 6 in the morning, his phone buzzed with a bank alert. Share transfer processed. Vivien Hart, 51% controlling interest Holston Industries. He put the phone down on the desk. Somewhere in Crown City, in whatever apartment or hotel or arrangement she had already prepared for herself, Vivien Hart was the majority owner of the company he had built from nothing. The company that bore his name for now. The company that would answer from this morning forward to someone else's judgment. Grant looked out the window at the garden in the early light. He had built an empire, and he had lost it. What he didn't know yet, what would take him considerably longer to understand, was that losing it was the first genuinely useful thing that had happened to him in years. But that lesson, like all important ones, would arrive slowly, and only after considerable pain. The moving trucks arrived at 6:30 in the morning as the sky was shifting from gray to pale gold. Grant watched them from the study window. 3 white vehicles pulling up the curved driveway of the Riverside mansion with the businesslike efficiency of people who had been given very clear instructions and intended to follow them precisely. Men in matching uniforms climbed out carrying flat-pack boxes and packing tape, and they began work immediately without waiting to be let in because Vivien had arranged access in advance. Vivien had arranged everything in advance. He watched the first box go through the front door and turned back to his desk. His driver arrived at 6:45. Grant texted him the address of the Meridian Corporate Suites on Fifth Avenue and carried his single suitcase down the stairs and through the house he'd owned for 15 years, trailing his fingers along walls he knew he'd never touch again. The formal dining room where they'd hosted 100 dinner parties. The kitchen where their housekeeper had made coffee every morning that smelled like something permanent and turned out to be as provisional as everything else. The foyer with the chandelier he'd purchased for $40,000 and the marble floor imported from Italy, all the markers of success that had seemed so essential and now appeared to him as what they had always been: furniture. Expensive, impeccably chosen furniture in a house that had never quite been a home. He picked up his suitcase and walked out without looking back. The Meridian Corporate Suites occupied a gleaming tower in Crown City's financial district, all glass and steel efficiency designed for executives in transition between positions or cities, furnished with the careful neutrality of spaces that had to belong to anyone and therefore belonged to no one. The apartment Damon had reserved was on the 23rd floor, high enough for a city view, low enough to suggest someone had thought about the premium pricing at the top, and concluded that Grant's situation did not warrant treating itself as exceptional. He unpacked his single suitcase into the bedroom closet and stood in the center of the living room. Leather furniture. Abstract art selected to be inoffensive. Kitchen with high-end appliances he would never use. Bedroom with blackout curtains. Rainfall shower. The complete infrastructure of a successful executive's temporary stay, available to anyone who could pay for it and belonging therefore to no one. His phone rang at 8 a.m. Marcus Webb, college roommate. The one person in Grant's life who had qualified as an actual friend, distinct from professional contacts, distinct from social allies, distinct from the category of people who called you back because you were useful for 30 years. Grant stared at the name on the screen for 2 rings. Then he answered. "You actually picked up," Marcus said. "I wasn't sure you would." "Neither was I," Grant said. He moved to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the Crown City skyline. His skyline. The one he'd helped build. It looked the same as always. This was somehow worse than if it had looked different. "If you're calling to tell me I'm an idiot, I already know. I'm calling because we've been friends for 30 years, and I figured you might need someone to talk to who isn't a lawyer or a reporter." A brief pause. "Also because Sarah made me promise to check on you. She's worried you might do something stupid. Tell Sarah I'm fine." "You're not fine. You just got publicly destroyed by your wife in front of everyone who matters in Crown City. That's the literal opposite of fine." Marcus's voice held genuine sympathy, but underneath it was something firmer, the directness of someone who had decided that comfort could wait while honesty got its turn. "The question is what you do next." "I don't know what I do next," Grant said. The words came out more honestly than he'd intended, the automatic social armor that usually managed this kind of exposure still temporarily offline. "I genuinely don't know." "Well, Marcus said, For starters, you don't do what you usually do, which is bulldoze forward, pretending nothing bothers you, while secretly planning how to destroy whoever got in your way. That's what got you here. Thank you for the insight, Grant said dryly. I'm serious, man. I've watched you operate for 3 decades. You're brilliant at business and terrible at people, and you've spent your entire adult life proving you're smarter and tougher than everyone else. Vivian just proved that when you push someone far enough, they push back harder than you expected. A pause. Learn something from it. Figure out why you blew up a 23-year marriage for someone you don't even love. Deal with whatever's driving the need for constant validation from new conquests. Grant said nothing because Marcus was right, and they both knew it. Call me if you need anything real, Marcus said. Otherwise, I'll check in next week. The call ended, leaving Grant with observations he wasn't ready to sit with but couldn't avoid. He stood at the window until his legs reminded him he'd been standing for some time, then moved to the couch and sat with the deliberate care of someone managing a body that had reported for duty but wasn't quite operational. By 9 a.m., his phone was alive with notifications. The board meeting was underway without him. An emergency session called at Vivien's direction to address leadership transitions and strategic restructuring in light of the overnight ownership changes. Real-time updates arrived in his inbox appointment of an interim CEO, formation of an audit committee to review 3 years of financial records, announcement of a comprehensive governance review. Vivien was moving fast. She was establishing control and cleaning house before anyone could mount organized opposition exactly the way Grant himself would have done it. She had learned well. She was striking decisively, consolidating power, remaking the organization in her image before resistance could form. By 10 a.m., national business publications were running the story. Most framed Vivien as a feminist icon. A few questioned the ethics of a public takedown. All of them agreed it was the most dramatic corporate transition Crown City had seen in decades, and several were already running analyst commentary on what the leadership change meant for Holston Industries' portfolio and strategic direction. His phone rang with Robert Chen's name, a major client, someone Grant had considered a friend, in the way that men who do significant business together sometimes call each other friends without examining whether the underlying relationship would survive a stress test. Grant. Robert's voice was carefully modulated, sympathetic, professional, the tone of a man delivering news that isn't good while observing all the forms. I'm calling as a courtesy. We're reviewing our contracts with Holston Industries given the transition in leadership and the questions around financial management. Our legal team has advised us to consider our options. You're pulling your business, Grant said. We're evaluating our position, Robert corrected, though the distinction was entirely cosmetic. I wanted to tell you personally before you heard through other channels. It's not personal, Grant. It's just prudent business practice given the circumstances. Of course, Grant said, keeping his voice even. I understand completely. After Robert hung up, Grant counted to 10 and then stopped counting because the number of similar calls that followed throughout the morning made counting pointless. 17 over 4 hours. Clients reconsidering. Vendors requesting new payment guarantees. Professional contacts suddenly very busy. The entire ecosystem that had sustained Holston Industries was quietly, politely, methodically withdrawing from association with his name. By noon, he had stopped answering the phone. By 2 p.m., the moving company had delivered the boxes from the Riverside mansion, 37 of them, stacked in the living room of the Meridian apartment, with an efficiency that made the logistics of his displacement concrete in a way that the legal documents hadn't quite managed. He stared at them without moving to open any. By 4 p.m., exhaustion overrode everything else, and he lay down on the bed fully clothed and fell into a dreamless sleep that lasted until darkness. He woke to the disorienting sensation of not knowing where he was. The Meridian's bedroom looked nothing like his room at the Riverside mansion, and for several panicked seconds he thought he might be in a hotel, and the previous 24 hours had been some elaborate, humiliating nightmare. Then memory reassembled itself with crushing weight, and he lay in the dark of his 23rd floor corporate apartment, understanding that this was real, that it had happened, that it was not going to reverse. His phone showed 11 o'clock and dozens of missed calls. He pulled up the news on autopilot and found without surprise, but with a fresh specific kind of pain, that Vivien had given a press conference at 3 p.m. He'd been asleep. She'd been building a new public narrative while he was unconscious. He watched the video. She looked radiant. Not happy, exactly composed was the better word. Completely in possession of herself and her moment. She stood behind a podium with the Holston Industries logo visible behind her and addressed the assembled press with the ease of someone who had been preparing for this exact scenario and had chosen to enjoy it rather than endure it. Holston Industries has always been a company focused on profit maximization above all else, she began. That focus built an impressive portfolio and generated significant returns. But it also created a culture where corners were cut, where workers were treated as disposable resources, and where community impact was an afterthought, if it was considered at all. Grant's jaw tightened. Under my leadership, we will maintain our commitment to excellence and profitability, Vivien continued. But we will also prioritize sustainability, ethical labor practices, and genuine community investment. We will prove that you can build wealth while also building value for employees, for communities, for stakeholders, not just for shareholders. A reporter cut in. Critics say you're using the company to make a political statement about your divorce. How do you respond? Vivien smiled, the particular smile of a woman who had anticipated this question and prepared for it without effort. I'd say those critics fundamentally misunderstand what happened. I didn't take control of Holston Industries to make a statement about my marriage. I took control because I'd spent 7 months systematically acquiring the means to do so, and I intend to use that control to build something better than what existed before. She paused. My personal life and my business decisions are separate matters. What about Grant Holston's role going forward? Mr. Holston retains a minority share in the company and will receive appropriate distributions according to his ownership stake. Beyond that, he has no operational role or strategic input. Another pause, briefer. We wish him well in his future endeavors. Grant threw his phone across the room. It bounced off the leather couch and landed somewhere he couldn't see. He sat in the dark of his temporary apartment, surrounded by boxes he hadn't unpacked, and felt for the first time since Vivien had walked onto that stage the full weight of what he'd lost. Not the company, not the house, not the status, or not only those things which were real and significant losses, but which could be theoretically recovered from. What he'd lost was Vivien, the woman who had stood beside him for 23 years, who had opened doors and smoothed paths and believed in him before anyone else had sufficient reason to, who had seen something in him that he had spent 2 decades failing to be worth. He'd taken her for granted so thoroughly, so completely, that he had never once considered she might have her own strength, her own strategy, her own capacity for decisive action when she finally decided that she'd had enough. And when she'd had enough, she'd done it with a precision and a ruthlessness that he was in the privacy of a dark room on the 23rd floor, compelled to admire, even as it had destroyed him. He retrieved his phone from wherever it had landed and pulled up her email again. You'll never find it by making someone else smaller to make yourself feel bigger. He read it 3 more times. He put the phone down. He was still sitting there at midnight when Lola's name lit up the screen. He almost didn't answer. He answered. Grant. Her voice was thick and ragged in the way of someone who has been crying for a long time. I don't know what to do. I can't go home. There are reporters outside my building. My boss called and said I should take some time off, which basically means I'm fired. My mother keeps calling and I don't know what to tell her. Lola? Grant said. He was too exhausted for this, too empty to provide comfort he didn't feel. What do you want me to do about it? A silence, sharp. I thought you'd help me. I thought we were in this together. We were never in anything together, Grant said. The words came out without the softening he might have manufactured 12 hours ago. You were someone I spent time with, that's all. I never promised you more than that. You said you loved me. Her voice cracked. You said Vivien didn't understand you. You said I made you feel alive. You said you were going to leave her eventually. I lied, Grant said. I said what you wanted to hear because it made things easier. I'm sorry if you believed it, but that's not my problem anymore. Another silence. Longer. When Lola spoke again, her voice had changed. The weeping had receded, and something colder had moved into the space it had vacated. You're a coward, she said. Vivien was right about you. You don't care about anyone except yourself. I was stupid to think you saw me as anything more than a toy. Probably, Grant agreed, because what else was there to say? I'm meeting with Damon Klein tomorrow, Lola said. I'm going to tell him everything, every conversation, every expense, every detail. Whatever deal Vivien offered me, I'm taking it, because at least she was honest about what she wanted. You just lied and lied until someone finally made you stop. She hung up. Grant sat with the dead phone in his hand and contemplated the fact that everyone in his life was actively engaged in ensuring his complete destruction. He should have felt angry, betrayed, outraged. Instead, he felt nothing except the hollow exhaustion of a man who has been running for 30 years and has finally involuntarily stopped. He didn't sleep again that night. He sat at the desk in the Meridian apartment and thought about Vivien's letters. The anniversary letters she'd written him every year for 20 years that he'd never opened, never acknowledged, never thought to ask about. He thought about the photograph on her nightstand. He thought about the way the warmth had left her eyes so gradually that he hadn't noticed it leaving, had simply registered at some point that it was gone and assigned the absence to her rather than to anything he'd done. He thought about what Marcus had said, about the 30 years of watching Grant prove he was smarter and tougher than everyone else, about what it meant that the one person who'd had the most reason to expect something real from him was the same person he'd treated most like furniture. At 6 a.m., his phone buzzed with the board meeting update. Interim CEO appointed, audit committee formed, governance review launched, Vivien Hart officially assuming executive chair effective immediately. The company he had built from nothing now answered to someone else. He put the phone on the desk and stared at the window. The first light of a new day was beginning to define the edges of the city he'd helped shape, and Grant Holston was sitting in a furnished corporate apartment with 37 boxes of his life stacked in the living room, trying to understand something he'd been avoiding for longer than he could honestly calculate. The something was this: he had spent 30 years building things and calling that living. He had mistaken achievement for purpose and status for meaning, and control for intimacy, and the whole architecture had been sound, impressive, genuinely impressive, right up until the moment it wasn't. Right up until the moment a woman he'd stopped seeing had decided to demonstrate with devastating precision what she'd been seeing all along. He owed her something for that. Not gratitude, not yet, not quite, but the beginning of an honest accounting. He opened his laptop. He did something he hadn't done since before his first promotion. At 23, he searched without a specific goal for therapists. Clinical psychologists. People whose professional function was to help other people understand why they did what they did and whether there was a better way forward. He found a name, Dr. Patricia Morrison, Executive Counseling and Life Transitions, and stared at it for a long time. Then he sent an email requesting an appointment. It was by any measure Grant had previously applied to his decisions a small and inconsequential action. It would not recover his company or his reputation or the 23 years of marriage he had spent building the wrong things. It would not undo what had been done. But it was the first decision he had made, and he honestly could not say how long that was not about what other people would think of it. And that, though he didn't know it yet, was where everything real that came next would have to begin. The weeks that followed were unlike anything Grant Holston had previously experienced, which was saying something since he had experienced a considerable range of things in 52 years of an eventful life. The days blurred together in the Meridian's sterile comfort. He woke too late, ordered food he barely tasted, scrolled through news coverage of his own downfall with the disconnected attention of a man watching a documentary about someone he used to know, and went back to sleep. The boxes from the Riverside mansion remained mostly unpacked monuments to a life he couldn't fully inhabit or completely abandon. He moved through the apartment, leaving them undisturbed, as if committing to unpacking would commit him to accepting that this was where he lived now, which it was. He just wasn't ready to say so. Marcus called every few days. Brief checking-in calls that didn't require Grant to perform wellness he didn't feel. Sarah Webb, Marcus's wife, a family therapist by training, sent 2 actual physical packages. Homemade food. The kind of care that arrived in containers rather than sentiments, practical and unfussy, and more touching for being so. Grant appreciated it without knowing how to say so and said nothing, which was his default response to anything that required genuine expression rather than performance. The press coverage eventually shifted from breaking news to analysis. Think pieces about corporate governance and gender dynamics in executive leadership, op-eds about accountability and the power of documentation. Long-form profiles of Vivien Hart as a new kind of business leader, thoughtful and incisive, building something in the space where something else had been. His Wikipedia page, he discovered one evening, now led with the divorce before mentioning his actual business accomplishments, as if the most defining event of his life was the one he'd caused rather than the one he'd built. Maybe it was. The financial reality settled in with the uncomfortable specificity of numbers. His 25% stake in what was already being called Hartwell Dominion in early press coverage was worth millions. The structured payout Vivien had agreed to meant quarterly distributions that would sustain him at a standard of living considerably above what most people considered comfortable. He would not want for money. But money and power were not the same thing, and Grant was discovering that power had been the substance he was actually addicted to. Money without control felt inert, like owning a car you couldn't drive. The wealth remained. The relevance was gone. On a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the gala doctor, Patricia Morrison's office called to confirm his appointment. He sat across from her that afternoon in a room that smelled of good wood and something faintly green and was arranged deliberately to feel nothing like a power environment. She was in her early 60s, impeccably professional, completely unmoved by any of his preliminary attempts to frame the situation in terms favorable to himself. The charm, the reasoned explanation, the presentation of circumstances that he'd deployed in boardrooms for 3 decades. She received all of it with the patient attention of someone who has heard this before and is waiting for what comes after the performance. "You've described what you lost," she said at the end of the first session, her pen poised above her notepad. "The company, the marriage, the status. What I haven't heard is any description of what you want." "I want my life back," Grant said. "That life is gone," she said without cruelty. "It's not available. So what do you actually want in the life that exists now?" Grant had no answer. That was new. That was possibly the first time in 30 years that he had been asked what he wanted and discovered he had no idea. Then that, Dr. Morrison said, is what we're going to find out. The work of therapy was harder than anything Grant had done in business, and he had done things in business that other men had called impossible. Examining his own motivations, his fears, the specific machinery of his need for validation, it felt like surgery performed without the relief of anesthesia. Each session with Dr. Morrison peeled back another layer of a narrative he'd spent decades constructing and maintaining, and what lay beneath the narrative was consistently less flattering than the version he'd been telling himself. She was good at her job. That much was clear almost immediately. She didn't commiserate. She didn't validate. She listened with the precise, unhurried attention of someone who understood that the most important thing a person said in any given session was rarely the first thing or the loudest, but the thing that came out sideways while they were talking about something else. In the second session, she asked about his father. Grant told the bankruptcy story, the way he'd always told it. Clean contained filed under formative experience and properly labeled the motivating trauma that explained his ambition without requiring him to examine whether ambition was all it had motivated. He told it the way a man tells a story he has told many times, with the practiced ease of something that has been processed. "That's a very tidy narrative," Dr. Morrison said when he finished. "It's accurate," Grant said. "Accuracy and completeness aren't the same thing," she said. "You've told me what happened to your father. You haven't told me what it felt like to be 17 and watch it happen." He sat with that question for 3 uncomfortable minutes before saying anything. What it had felt like was terror. Not the cinematic kind, not dramatic fear, not the kind that announced itself. The quiet, persistent terror of a boy who had understood at 17 that security was an illusion, that the ground beneath your feet was always provisional, that everything you built could be taken in an afternoon by forces you hadn't accounted for, and the only protection against that possibility was to become powerful enough that the forces wouldn't dare. He told her this haltingly, in the language of someone unaccustomed to describing interior states he'd spent 30 years papering over with action and achievement. So when Grant Holston builds an empire, Dr. Morrison said, without looking up from her notes, he's not building wealth. He's building a wall between himself and the 17-year-old who watched his father lose everything. That's reductive, Grant said. Is it wrong? She asked. He didn't answer. In the fourth session, she asked about Vivien, not about the affair, not about the divorce proceedings or the share transfer or the logistics of the separation. She asked about Vivien in the early years, what Grant had noticed about her, what had drawn him to her, what the first years of their marriage had actually felt like before, whatever had shifted. Grant talked for longer than he expected to. He talked about the way she'd laughed at a dinner party in the second year of their marriage, throwing her head back with a genuine abandon that had surprised him because it was so unlike the composed social poise she normally wore. He talked about a Sunday in their fifth year when she'd spent 3 hours teaching him to properly make risotto because he'd mentioned once that he'd always wanted to know how she had remembered months later and cleared an entire Sunday afternoon. He talked about how she'd handled a crisis at her foundation, a funding collapse that had threatened to shutter 3 of their programs with the kind of strategic calm he'd always associated with the best executives he'd encountered, and how he had been impressed in the moment and then forgotten it within a week because it didn't fit the category he'd placed her in. What category was that? Dr. Morrison asked. Support, Grant said. Then more honestly, decoration. The word sat between them. She was running a $30 million organization, Dr. Morrison said, and you filed it under decoration. Yes, Grant said. The sessions continued. Each one excavated something he'd have preferred to leave buried. The pattern that emerged slowly across 8 weeks of weekly appointments was not flattering and not surprising once he could see it whole, a man so afraid of being powerless that he'd made himself powerful in every direction, including over the one person who had actually cared about him, and in doing so had systematically eliminated the very intimacy he'd claimed to want. Vivien hadn't left him because he'd had an affair. The affair was a symptom. She'd left him because he'd spent 23 years treating her as a resource rather than a person, and she had finally comprehensively decided that she was worth more than that. And the part that was hardest to sit with, the part that arrived in the 8th session while he was talking about something apparently unrelated, and came out sideways exactly as Dr. Morrison had predicted, was that he'd known somewhere underneath the performance of certainty and control that she was worth more. He'd always known. He'd simply chosen not to act on it because acknowledging her worth would have required acknowledging his debt to her, and Grant had spent 30 years refusing to acknowledge debts. What would it mean to be worth something without the achievements to point to? Dr. Morrison asked in the 10th session. Grant sat with the question for the full duration of the silence she'd learned to give him before redirecting. I don't know, he said finally. I've never tried to find out. Good, she said. That means we have somewhere to go. The boxes from the Riverside mansion had been unpacked finally, sometime in the 4th week. Not all at once, in small increments, as Grant became incrementally more willing to accept that this apartment was where he lived and not simply where he was waiting. Suits in the closet, books on the shelves, the photographs filed in a drawer because looking at them daily was not something he was ready for yet. One box, however, he had not opened. It was a small wooden box, a Hart family heirloom. He recognized it immediately, something Vivien's grandmother had given her as a wedding gift. He'd seen it on various surfaces in various rooms of the Riverside mansion over the years, and had never once thought to ask what was in it. When he finally pried it open 3 weeks into his residence at the Meridian, he found letters. Dozens of them written in Vivien's elegant handwriting on heavy cream stationery, each one dated, each one addressed to him. He opened the first one from their 2nd anniversary. My darling Grant, I know you don't remember, but 2 years ago today you promised to build a life with me that honored both our dreams, not just your ambitions. I'm writing this as a reminder to myself that the man I married is still in there somewhere underneath the drive and the determination. I believe in you, even when you forget to believe in us. All my love. V. He sat with the letter in his hands for a long time. Then he opened the next one, and the next. He read them in order, sitting on the floor of the Meridian apartment, with the wooden box beside him, working through 20 years of Vivien trying to reach a man who had been too occupied with other things to notice she was trying. The letters charted the deterioration of their marriage with the clarity of a detailed record. Hopes in the early years, concern in the middle ones, resignation in the later ones, and finally, from their 20th anniversary, something that was neither hope nor resignation, but the calm, certain voice of a woman who had accepted the situation for what it was and was no longer afraid of the implications. Grant, this is the last letter I will write you. Not because I'm giving up, but because I've finally accepted that you are exactly who you've always been, and I was the fool who kept expecting you to change. You married me for my connections and my family name. I married you because I thought you'd grow into someone who valued more than power and money. We were both wrong about who the other person was. I don't hate you for it. I just don't have anything left to give to someone who never wanted what I had to offer. This is goodbye to the marriage I imagined we'd have. What comes next is just logistics and appearances. I'll play my role perfectly because that's what Hart women do. But the real marriage ended today, whether you realize it or not. V. He set that letter down. He had no words for what he felt. Or rather, he had too many a density of emotion that had accumulated over weeks of suppression and now seemed to have arrived all at once, filling the space he'd been keeping it out of with the indifferent efficiency of water finding its own level. In the wooden box beneath the letters, there was one more piece of paper, a single sheet undated in the same elegant handwriting. Grant, I'm leaving these letters with your belongings so that you'll understand that what happened at the Celestia Grand wasn't sudden or impulsive. I gave you 20 years to see me as a person rather than an accessory. You never did. Everything that followed was consequence, not cruelty. I hope someday you understand the difference. Be well. V. He read it twice, put it back in the box, replaced the other letters on top of it, and closed the lid. He sat on the floor of the apartment for a long time after that, not thinking in any organized way, not planning anything, not running any of the internal calculations he'd spent 30 years treating as default cognitive function. Just sitting with the full weight of what he'd learned from a wooden box full of letters he'd never known existed. She had loved him. For years she had loved him and tried to reach him and documented the attempt with the patience of someone who believed right up until they stopped believing that the person on the other side of the letters was worth reaching. He had not in all the years she'd been writing them opened a single one. He thought about what that meant for a long time. Then he opened his laptop and wrote an email to Marcus, accepting the standing dinner invitation that Marcus had been extending for 6 weeks. It was like the email to Dr. Morrison, a small thing. It would not repair what he'd broken. It was not intended to. But it was a step towards something that was not the life he'd been living, and in the absence of any other reliable direction that was enough to move on. Sunday arrived with the particular gentleness of a day that doesn't need to prove anything. Crown City's trees were showing early autumn color. Soft golds at the edges, the turning of something that had been green all summer without announcing that it would not always stay that way. Grant drove himself to Marcus and Sarah's house in the suburbs and sat in the driveway for 5 minutes with the engine off, engaged in the specific negotiation of convincing himself that going inside was a better option than driving away. The front door opened before he'd resolved it. Sarah Webb stood on the porch with crossed arms and the expression of a woman who has been watching a car sit in her driveway long enough to form an opinion about it. "I saw you pull in 8 minutes ago," she said. "Are you planning to sit in the car all evening, or are you going to come inside like a person?" "Still deciding," Grant admitted, getting out. She crossed the porch and hugged him. The hug lasted slightly longer than strictly necessary, which he chose not to analyze, and when she released him, she looked at him with the direct, uncomplicated concern of someone who had known him long enough to see past the parts he was showing. "You look terrible," she said. "When's the last time you slept properly?" "Define properly." "More than 4 hours without alcohol being a prerequisite." Grant couldn't remember which was. He understood an answer. Sarah sighed and gestured him inside. The house smelled like roasting chicken and bread, the kind of smell that arrived in the chest rather than just the nose. Marcus appeared from the kitchen in an apron carrying a beer, looking like a man who had made a bet about whether Grant would show up and was pleased to have won it. "You actually came," Marcus said, handing him the beer. "Sarah would have kidnapped me otherwise." "Damn right," Sarah said, already heading for the living room. "Come sit down. We're doing the intervention I've been planning since the gala." They sat Grant on the couch, Marcus and Sarah in the armchairs that faced him, with the comfortable symmetry of people who had apparently been waiting for this conversation. Outside the windows, the suburban afternoon went about its entirely ordinary business, indifferent to anything happening inside. "So," Sarah said without preamble, "how are you actually doing?" "Fine," Grant said automatically. "Try again." Grant took a long drink of beer. He thought about Dr. Morrison and her observation that the most important things came out sideways while you were talking about something else, and decided he was tired enough to skip the sideways entirely. "I don't know how to be irrelevant," he said. "I wake up every day with nowhere to be and nothing to do and no idea who I am without the company and the position and the context. I don't know what I am without the thing I spent 30 years building." Sarah nodded. "That's the first honest thing I've heard you say in years. It doesn't change anything." "No," Sarah agreed, "but it's the first step toward maybe not making the same mistakes in whatever comes next." She held his gaze with the directness of someone who has decided the time for social softening has passed. "You want to know what I thought when I saw the news about the gala?" "My first reaction wasn't surprise at what Vivien did. It was surprise that she waited so long to do it." Grant said nothing. "Grant, everyone knew," Marcus said. Not unkindly, but without cushioning. "Not everyone knew about Lola specifically, but everyone could see that your marriage was that you treated Vivien like someone who existed to support what you were doing, not like a person who had her own life and her own worth." "We talked to her," Sarah said. Grant looked up. 6 months ago. She called me and said she needed advice from someone outside the situation. We met for coffee. She told me what she was planning and asked me if I thought she was being vindictive." "What did you tell her?" Grant asked. His voice had gone carefully neutral in the way of someone managing a reaction they're not ready to display. "I told her that vindictive would be doing it quietly and taking you for everything in court. What she was planning was accountability. Making sure you couldn't spin the narrative, couldn't make yourself the victim, couldn't walk away without consequences." Sarah paused. "I also told her to protect herself financially, because you'd use every resource available to maintain control if she gave you the chance." Grant sat with that for a moment. "So you helped her?" "I supported my friend who was being betrayed by her husband," Sarah said without apology. "Yes. Before you ask, I don't regret it." The conversation continued for another 2 hours, working through the things that needed to be said. Uncomfortable things, accurate things, the kind of truths that could only be delivered by people who had known you long enough to be certain you could survive hearing them. Marcus and Sarah said them without cruelty and without sentimentality, the way people who care about someone tell them the truth directly, completely, and with the absolute conviction that honesty is a more useful form of kindness than comfort. Grant listened. He pushed back occasionally, less from genuine disagreement than from the reflex of someone accustomed to having the last word. But the pushback was quieter than it would have been 3 months ago. Something was shifting beneath the surface of the old patterns in the direction of willingness. He stayed for dinner. He stayed until nearly 11. When he left, Sarah walked him to his car and gave him another hug that lasted longer than strictly necessary. "You're not a bad person, Grant," she said quietly. "You're just someone who's been operating from fear and insecurity for so long that you forgot how to be anything else." She released him and stepped back. "But you can learn if you're willing to do the work." "Therapy is apparently a good start," Grant said. "Is it working?" He thought about it. "I don't know yet," he said. "But I'm starting to understand questions I didn't know I had." Sarah smiled. "That counts." He drove back to the Meridian through the autumn streets, thinking about fear and worth and the 30 years he'd spent confusing one for the other. The wooden box sat on the dining room table where he'd left it after the letters. He sat down across from it when he got home and looked at it for a while without opening it. Then he opened his laptop. He was beginning to understand a very great deal to figure out, and almost none of it had to do with business. 6 months after the Celestia Grand Gala, Grant Holston stood in front of 20 undergraduate business students at Crown City Community College and felt his hand shake. This was new. His hands had not shaken in a board meeting in 30 years. They had not shaken while signing documents that committed hundreds of millions of dollars to high-risk developments. They had not shaken in the conference room of the Celestia Grand while Damon Klein laid out the legal terms of his own undoing. But they shook now, standing at the front of a classroom that smelled of whiteboard markers and institutional coffee, facing 20 young people who were waiting to see if he had anything worth saying. He decided to start with the truth. "My name is Grant Holston," he said, and the shaking in his hands began to subside as his voice found its footing. "6 months ago, I lost everything I'd spent 30 years building. Not because the market turned or because my competitors outmaneuvered me or because of some external force I couldn't have anticipated." He paused. "Because I was too arrogant to see that my wife was smarter than me and too selfish to value the marriage I had over the ego I was protecting. I'm not here to teach you how to build a successful business. I'm here to tell you what happens when you build success on a foundation of arrogance and when you measure your worth entirely by external achievement, and when you treat people as resources to exploit rather than human beings deserving of respect." The room was very quiet, Dr. Morrison's idea. In their 10th session, the one where he'd admitted he had no idea what he wanted from the life he was building, she'd asked him what he was good at separate from running a real estate empire. He'd said he was good at identifying mistakes, at understanding in retrospect exactly where decisions had gone wrong. She'd suggested there might be value in sharing that knowledge with people who were building things and had not yet made the particular category of mistakes Grant had made at scale. She'd connected him with a colleague who taught at Crown City Community College. Somehow, and Grant was still not entirely sure how the conversation had arrived at this outcome, he'd agreed to teach a 6-week course on business ethics and leadership failures. The first 2 classes had been the most uncomfortable hours of his professional life. Worse than the conference room with Damon. Worse almost than sitting at table 3 while Vivien read his text messages to 300 people. Because in the conference room, he'd been managing a situation. In the classroom, there was nothing to manage. There was only standing in front of young people with no insulation of power or reputation and saying true things about who he had been and what it had cost. By the 3rd class, something had shifted. The students had stopped treating him as a cautionary tale and started engaging with him as a human being who had made specific, identifiable mistakes that they could learn from and potentially avoid. Questions came faster. The conversations lasted past the scheduled end of class. A young woman named Destiny, who asked the sharpest questions and showed the least patience for anything that smelled like self-justification, started the 4th class by asking him directly whether he thought he'd actually changed or was just performing change because it was now strategically advantageous. "Both, probably," Grant said. "At the beginning. But there's a version of those things where the performance eventually becomes real. Where doing the right thing for the wrong reason long enough becomes doing it for the right reason." "I don't know if I'm there yet. I'm trying to find out." Destiny considered this for a moment. "How do you know the difference?" "I'm not sure you can from the inside," Grant admitted. "I think it's other people who see it first." Today's session was on power dynamics in professional relationships. Grant had prepared more carefully for this one than for any board presentation in recent memory, not because the audience had more at stake, but because the material did. He was going to talk about Vivien. "My ex-wife tried to tell me for 20 years that our marriage was failing," he said. He clicked to a slide that showed the wooden box. The room leaned forward almost imperceptibly. "She wrote me letters. Every anniversary. 20 letters over 20 years telling me she was trying to reach me, telling me she still believed there was something real between us if I would just pay attention to it." He paused. "I never opened a single one, not because I was avoiding them, because I didn't know they existed. She left them in a box I never thought to look in because I had never in 20 years of marriage thought to ask what she kept in that box." He clicked to the next slide. The classroom was very still. "After the divorce, after she took my company and my house and the public standing I'd spent 30 years building, she had her things packed and sent to wherever she'd moved, and she left those letters in a box with my belongings. So I'd understand that what happened wasn't sudden. She'd been trying for 2 decades to be seen as a person. When I finally failed comprehensively enough that she had no option except to act, she acted. And she was catastrophically effective. Because she's brilliant." He paused. "And because I had spent 20 years dismissing her as background scenery, which meant she had 20 years to study how I operated without me ever looking back." A student raised his hand. David, who had been quiet in earlier sessions but engaged with a focused, careful attention that suggested he was absorbing more than he was commenting on. Mr. Holston, David said, why are you telling us this? You could teach business ethics without being this specific about your own failures. Grant thought about it. Because the general version is easier to dismiss, he said. It's easy to learn the lesson that treating people as means to an end is wrong as an abstraction. It's harder to dismiss when the person telling you about it is sitting in front of you and you can see what it cost them. He set down the marker he'd been holding. I had access to all the same general wisdom you do. I knew in theory that what I was doing was wrong. I just never applied it to myself because I always believed I was the exception, that my particular situation was different. He looked out at the classroom. Everyone believes they're the exception. Nobody is. The question and answer period after that session ran 20 minutes over the scheduled end of class. When it was finally done and the students filed out the professor who'd arranged the course, a woman named Dr. Elaine Cooper, who had watched all 6 sessions with the quiet attention of a scientist, observing a phenomenon, lingered at the doorway. I want to tell you something, she said. I had genuine doubts about whether this would work. A disgraced executive teaching ethics felt on paper like it might come across as either performative or self-serving. She paused. It didn't. Those students are going to remember this course, not because of the business content, they can get that anywhere, because you showed them what accountability actually looks like, and that's considerably rarer. Grant nodded, not quite trusting his voice. One of my students, Destiny Williams, came to office hours after last week's session, Dr. Cooper added. She asked me if I thought you were going to be okay. I thought you'd want to know that. He drove home from the community college with the windows down, the October air moving through the car, with the particular clarity of a season that has given up pretending to be something warmer. He thought about what Dr. Cooper had said. He thought about Destiny asking whether he was going to be okay. He thought, beginning to believe the answer might be yes. Not immediately. Not completely. Not in the way that his old life had been fine, the kind of fine that was constructed and maintained and required constant resource input to sustain, but in the quieter, sturdier sense of someone who had lost the performance and was discovering tentatively that there was a person underneath it. He was also, almost without noticing, doing what Dr. Morrison had suggested he try, figuring out what he was worth separate from what he'd built. Teaching felt like evidence. Spending time with Marcus and Sarah, who continued to invite him to dinners that had no professional utility for either of them, felt like evidence. Showing up weekly to an appointment where someone asked him hard questions and expected honest answers that felt like evidence too. He was in his apartment that evening working on the outline of something he'd started to call internally a book, not a memoir. Nothing so self-serving, but a practical account of every leadership mistake he'd made and what he understood about them. Now that he'd had the benefit of losing everything and doing several months of enforced reflection when his phone buzzed with a number he didn't recognize. He almost let it go to voicemail. Hello? Grant. A pause. It's Lola. He sat with the phone for a moment, not speaking. In the 6 months since the gala, since their last conversation, in which she'd told him he was a coward, and he'd agreed Lola Reyes had not contacted him. She had, according to the legal documents Damon's office had forwarded, provided comprehensive testimony about the affair, confirmed the financial details, and fulfilled her obligations under the agreement Vivien had offered. She had done what she'd said she would do, and then she had been silent. I'm not calling about the past, Lola said carefully when it became clear he wasn't going to volunteer a response. I'm not calling to relitigate anything. I've been in therapy for 6 months dealing with my part in what happened, and I don't need to revisit it with you. Another pause, briefer. I'm calling about something professional. I have a business proposal, and I think you might be the right person to advise on it. Are you free to meet? Grant's first instinct was refusal. His second instinct was to examine his first instinct, which he was getting better at slowly by degrees. Was he considering agreeing because he was genuinely curious about her proposal? Or because some part of him was still oriented toward any context in which he could be the person with more power and more experience, the one who conferred rather than received? He sat with it. He sent Dr. Morrison a text. Ex-mistress wants to meet about a business proposal. Is this a terrible idea? Her response arrived within minutes. Depends. Are you meeting her to feel powerful again, or because you're genuinely curious about the proposal? Check your motives before you respond. He sat with that for several hours. Then he texted Lola back Tuesday at 2. The coffee shop on 5th and Market. This is purely professional. Her response was immediate. Absolutely. Thank you. Tuesday arrived clear and cool. Grant got there 15 minutes early, ordered black coffee, and took a table near the window. He had developed in the months since the gala the habit of arriving early and sitting in public places and observing the ordinary traffic of other people's lives. The couple at the next table debating what to eat. The young man across the room working on something on a laptop with the intense focus of someone building towards something they haven't told anyone about yet. The elderly woman by the door who sat with her tea and watched the street with the unhurried contentment of someone who no longer needed to be anywhere in particular. He found this comforting in a way he hadn't expected. The world's indifference to his particular situation, the fact that life continued at ordinary scale through and around and entirely regardless of the dramatic events that had rearranged his. Lola arrived exactly at 2. She looked different. The designer labels were gone, replaced by something more understated and somehow more confident, the style of a person who had made choices rather than performed them. Her dark hair was cut into a clean, sharp bob. She carried herself with a certainty that seemed earned rather than projected. She had grown up, Grant thought. In 6 months, she had grown up. They shook hands across the table with the formal precision of people who need external structure to manage a charged situation. "Thank you for coming," she said. "You said it was professional," he said. "I'm treating it as professional." "Good." She set a tablet on the table between them and pulled up a presentation that at a glance had the structure and visual precision of someone who had prepared seriously. "But first I owe you something, an apology. Not for cooperating with Vivien, that was right and I'd do it again, but for my part in getting involved in the first place." She met his eyes directly. "I knew you were married. I told myself all kinds of stories about how it was different, how Vivien didn't understand you, how we had something real. But the truth is I was using you for career advancement, and the excitement of something I told myself was special, and I ignored the damage because it benefited me." Grant looked at her. The apology was more direct than he'd expected, more genuine. "I appreciate you saying that," he said carefully. "Though I want to be clear, what happened wasn't your fault. You didn't seduce me away from a happy marriage. I pursued you because I was bored and arrogant and wanted to feel powerful. You were young and ambitious, and I exploited that. If anyone should be apologizing, it's me." "We can both be sorry," Lola said with a slight smile that held something wry and real. "Vivien taught me that accountability isn't a competition." Grant sat back. "You've been talking to Vivien. She reached out after I gave my testimony. I almost didn't agree to meet her. I was terrified she'd destroy me the way she destroyed you at the gala." Lola paused. "She didn't. She was direct about what I'd done wrong, but she helped me understand that one catastrophically bad decision didn't have to define everything that came after it." "That sounds like Vivien," Grant said quietly. "She always could see potential in people, even when they couldn't see it themselves." Lola nodded. "She helped me get a new position, marketing for a firm that specializes in ethical brands and social impact. Different world from what I was doing before." She turned the tablet to face him. "And through that work I identified a gap." The presentation was good. Clean problem statement, rigorous market research, financial projections that were aggressive but grounded. The concept was a technology platform to democratize sustainability. Verification for small businesses, large corporations could afford the third-party audit process, but the smaller companies often doing the most innovative ethical work couldn't. Blockchain for transparency. AI for efficiency, access for everyone. "This is solid," Grant said. He was aware of his own business instincts re-engaging the pattern. Recognition, the market assessment, the identification of what would and wouldn't work, and was also aware that they were engaging differently than they would have 12 months ago. Less reflexively oriented toward competitive advantage. More genuinely curious about whether the thing could work and what it would do in the world if it did. "Why are you bringing it to me?" he asked. "Because I need an advisor who knows how to scale something from nothing, Someone who's made every mistake there is to make. She held his gaze. I know it's strange to ask you, but Vivien suggested it. That stopped him. Vivien suggested you work with me. Not work together directly. She was very clear that any arrangement would need to go through proper contracts with independent oversight. But she said that if I could get past my embarrassment and you could get past your ego, you might actually help me build something real. Lola paused. She said you were brilliant at business, even if you were terrible at being human, and that maybe the best thing you could do with your experience was help people who were trying to build things based on values. Grant sat with this information for a moment. Vivien was still thinking about him, still in whatever orbit her extraordinary life now occupied, occasionally exerting the kind of careful, strategic generosity that had apparently always been available to her, but which he'd never been interested enough to see. She was orchestrating his redemption the same way she'd orchestrated his destruction. Not impulsively, not dramatically, but with patience and intelligence and a genuine investment in the outcome. He didn't deserve it. He understood that clearly. But he was beginning to understand with the help of Dr. Morrison and Marcus and Sarah and 20 undergraduates who asked hard questions that deserving was perhaps not the most useful frame. The more useful frame was, what do you do with what's offered? What exactly are you asking from me? He said. Advisory role, c'était, equity stake if you want it, consulting fees if you prefer, monthly meetings, honest feedback. She met his eyes. And most importantly, introductions if you're comfortable making them to people who might fund something like this. Why do you trust me not to try to take over or push you out? Because Vivien said she'd end both of us if you tried. Lola said it without flinching. Any agreement we make goes through her attorney with provisions that protect my controlling interest. You'd be an advisor, not a partner. If you violate the terms, you lose whatever equity you've contributed, and I get to keep everything. Grant almost smiled. She really did think of everything. She always has, Lola said simply. You were just the last person to notice. They spent the next hour going through the business plan, Grant asking questions and offering observations in a mode that felt unfamiliar and right at the same time. He wasn't optimizing for his own position. He wasn't looking for angles. He was looking at the business on its own terms, evaluating what it needed and whether he could provide it. I'll need to see the full plan and the proposed contract terms before I commit to anything, Grant said as their meeting was wrapping up. And I want to be honest about something. I'm not the same person I was 8 months ago. I'm learning to operate from integrity rather than strategy, which means I'm slower than I used to be, and I make different decisions than I used to make. If you need someone who's going to be aggressive and ruthless, I'm genuinely not that person anymore. That's exactly why I want to work with you, Lola said. I don't need someone to teach me how to win at any cost. I need someone who can teach me how to build something sustainable without destroying people in the process. They agreed to move forward pending contract review, and Lola packed up her tablet with the contained energy of someone managing more excitement than they were showing. As she stood to leave, she paused. Can I ask you something personal? You can ask, Grant said. Do you regret it? Not the way it ended, I mean all of it. The affair, the marriage, all of it. Grant thought about it with the care the question deserved. I regret hurting Vivien, he said. I regret wasting 23 years of marriage because I was too self-absorbed to appreciate what I had. I regret that I had to lose everything before I was willing to examine who I actually was underneath the achievement and the status. He paused. But do I regret that it happened? He thought about the wooden box. About the letters he'd spent 20 years not opening, about what it had cost both of them for him to remain the person who didn't open them. No, he said. Because I was destroying Vivien, slowly making her invisible, making her smaller, and I was destroying myself by measuring my worth through things that couldn't hold the weight I was putting on them. What happened was painful and humiliating, but it forced both of us to become people we couldn't have been otherwise. Lola nodded slowly. Vivien said something similar, that sometimes the kindest thing life can do is destroy the comfortable lies you've been living. She was always the smarter one, Grant said. I just didn't know how to see it until she showed me. After Lola left, Grant sat in the coffee shop for another hour, watching the afternoon world move through its ordinary business. A mother with a stroller negotiating the door. Two teenagers arguing amiably over a shared phone. An older man reading an actual newspaper, his coffee going cold beside him, completely absorbed. Grant took out his phone and opened a new email. He wasn't sure what to call what he was writing. The book had no title yet, but he had a first paragraph and it had arrived while Lola was talking about accountability not being a competition. He typed it out before it could leave him. I spent 30 years building an empire and I thought I understood what power was. I didn't. Power is what you have when other people trust you. Everything else is just leverage, and leverage runs out. He looked at the paragraph for a moment. Then he saved it in a folder labeled simply Book. That evening, arriving back at the Meridian, he found an envelope that had been slipped under his door. His name was written on the outside in an elegant script he recognized immediately. Inside was a single card, heavy cream stock embossed edges, the Hart family stationery that had occupied a corner of every desk Vivien had ever sat at. Grant. I heard about your work at Horizon Hope and the community college. Eleanor speaks very highly of you. Several students have reached out to thank me for funding the ethics program. I'm writing to say, I'm glad you found a way forward. I hope you continue building a life that's meaningful to you. This will be my last communication. Be well. V. He read it 3 times. He understood reading it that this was Vivien's final gift to him. Acknowledgement that he was trying, confirmation that his efforts mattered, and clear, absolute closure that their story was over. No reconciliation. No ongoing connection. Just the grace of someone who had no obligation to be generous and was generous anyway. He placed the card in the wooden box on top of the 20 anniversary letters. A bookend to a chapter that had definitively closed. He sat at the desk and continued working on the outline of the book. He wrote for 2 hours until the city outside had gone quiet, and the only light in the apartment was the desk lamp and the glow of the laptop screen. Then he stopped writing and just sat in the ordinary, unheroic quiet of a man who had no power and no status and no empire, and found that he could breathe. The 1-year anniversary of the gala arrived on a Thursday. Grant spent the morning in therapy processing the complex mixture of grief and gratitude that came with marking the date of the thing that had ended his life as he'd known it and made possible something different. How do you feel about where you are now versus where you were a year ago? Doctor, Morrison asked in her customary way of asking questions that sounded simple. Grant thought about it carefully. A year ago I had money and power and status and absolutely no idea who I was without those things, he said. Now I have less money and no power and no status, and I'm starting to understand that those aren't the right measures. He paused. I wake up most mornings without dreading the day, which is more than I could say a year ago. Are you happy? Grant considered. I'm useful. I'm learning. I'm building relationships that aren't based on what people can do for me. That feels like more than happy. That feels like something that might hold. That evening, Marcus Webb called. Sarah wanted me to check in, see how you're doing on the anniversary and all. Tell her I appreciate it, Grant said. But I'm actually okay. He paused, surprised to find that he meant it. I'm going to stay in tonight. Work on the book. The book, Marcus said. You're really writing it. I think so. It started as notes, and it's become something with chapters. Grant looked at the stack of pages beside his laptop. I figure if I'm going to be a cautionary tale, I might as well make the lesson clear enough that other people can learn from it without blowing up their own lives to get there. That's a good idea, Marcus said. Let me know when you need a reader. I will. And Marcus? Grant paused. Thank you. For staying. A brief silence. That's what 30 years is for, Marcus said. Get some sleep. Grant sat at the desk after the call ended the wooden box of Vivien's letters beside him. The first paragraph of the book on the screen in front of him and 30 pages after it. The outline of a version of himself he was still in the process of building. He opened the book and kept writing. Outside the Meridian's 23rd floor windows, Crown City went about its entirely ordinary Thursday evening, indifferent, purposeful, alive with the 10,000 small decisions and quiet ambitions and ordinary moments that made up the actual texture of lives actually being lived. Grant wrote until midnight. Then he closed the laptop, put the wooden box back on the shelf, and went to bed in the ordinary quiet of a man who was not powerful and not famous and not important in any of the ways he'd spent 30 years making himself important, and found that the quiet was enough. More than enough. It was real. The weeks that followed the first anniversary moved with a rhythm Grant hadn't previously experienced, unhurried, purposeful, not optimized toward any particular destination, but not aimless either. Something had shifted in the quality of his days. He woke with the early light rather than fighting his way to consciousness in the late morning. He ate actual meals. He replied to Marcus's texts within the same day rather than letting them accumulate into evidence of how far he'd withdrawn. The advisory work with Lola's company began formally in early November after the contracts came through from Damon Klein's office provisions for Grant's role, protections for Lola's control oversight mechanisms that Vivien's attorney had apparently supervised with the same thoroughness she brought to everything else. Grant reviewed them with Dr. Morrison before signing, which felt absurd and turned out to be necessary. She pointed out in her characteristic sideways manner that he had initially read a provision protecting Lola's decision-making authority as an insult to his expertise rather than as a reasonable protection for a new founder entering a relationship with someone who had a documented history of taking over things. "That's worth examining," Dr. Morrison said. He examined it. He signed the contracts the following week. The advisory meetings began on the second Tuesday of November. Lola had found a co-founder, a software engineer named James Park, who had spent 8 years building verification systems for supply chains and had been looking for exactly the kind of application that Lola had identified. Together, they made the particular complementary pair that early-stage ventures needed: vision and execution in the same room. Grant contributed a third-thing pattern recognition for the mistakes that would kill a young company before it could become a mature one. He'd made most of them himself. "The instinct when you're growing fast is to hire quickly," Grant told them in their second session. "You're overwhelmed, you need help, and the first people who express genuine enthusiasm feel like answers. They're usually not. The people who will define your culture in year 2 are the people you hire in month 6. Hire slowly. Hire for alignment with what you're actually trying to build, not just for the gap you're currently experiencing." James nodded, taking notes. "I'd have told you that was obvious 8 months ago," Grant added. "I'd also have ignored it. I made that mistake with 3 early Holston Industries hires who were talented and entirely wrong for the organization, and the damage was still visible 10 years later." Lola looked at him across the table with the considering expression of someone recalibrating something. "You're different when you're talking about this," she said. "How so?" "Before at Holston Industries events, at the few things I saw you at, before you talked about business like it was a sport, like the point was winning." She paused. "You're talking about it like you actually care whether the thing we're building does what it's supposed to do." Grant thought about it. "I think that might be new," he admitted. "I think that might be what happens when you stop tracking your own score." Alongside the advisory work, he had deepened his involvement at Horizon Hope. Eleanor Jameson had accepted his initial offer of help with the cautious enthusiasm of a woman accustomed to managing the motivations of wealthy benefactors, and had put him to work with the employment training program, teaching resume writing and interview skills to teenagers aging out of the foster care system. The work was humbling in ways that his community college teaching had not been. The community college students were young and relatively unformed, building identities they'd largely chosen. The Horizon Hope kids were young and had been shaped by circumstances they hadn't chosen, carrying the weight of systems that had failed them, and the particular hard-won competence of people who have had to be resilient before they understood what resilience cost. A 17-year-old named Marcus, coincidence of name, that the elder Marcus Webb found delightful when Grant mentioned it was preparing for his first job interview and had the sharpest, most suspicious intelligence Grant had encountered outside a boardroom. "They're going to ask about my weaknesses," Marcus said one afternoon, going over interview prep materials with the focused skepticism of someone who has been given enough wrong advice to distrust all of it on principle. "Everyone says to say you work too hard or you're a perfectionist. That's not a real answer." "It's not," Grant agreed. "Don't say it." "So what do I say? A real weakness. Something you're actually working on. They're not looking for someone who doesn't have weaknesses they know everyone does. They're looking for someone who's honest enough to name one and self-aware enough to be doing something about it. Marcus looked at him with the evaluating expression of someone deciding whether to trust information from a questionable source. Did you do that when you had your company? No, Grant said. I spent 20 years surrounded by people who were afraid to tell me my weaknesses because I'd penalize them for it. Problems got bigger before I found out about them. It was catastrophically inefficient. He paused. Don't make my mistakes. The ones that got you on the news? Marcus asked with the directness of a teenager who has decided that social circumspection is a resource not worth spending. Those, yes. Grant held his gaze. The ones that got me on the news were a symptom of the mistakes I'd been making for 30 years. By the time they were visible, they were just the thing that made everyone else see what had already been there. Marcus was quiet for a moment, processing. Why are you here? He said finally. Teaching people like me instead of like going somewhere and starting over. Grant had thought about this. He'd thought about it in Dr. Morrison's office and on the drive to Horizon Hope and in the quiet of the Meridian apartment at the hour when honest questions arrived without requesting permission. Because this matters more, he said. The business stuff made me money. It gave me status and power. It made me feel like I was important. He looked at Marcus, who was watching him with the unguarded attention of someone who could always tell when an adult was being straight with them. But it didn't make me a better person. This helping you figure out how to get the first job, the one that opens the door to the next thing, this actually matters. And I wasted a lot of years on things that felt like they mattered and didn't. Marcus absorbed this in the particular thoughtful way of someone storing it for later. Okay, he said. So about the weaknesses question, what should I actually say? Grant smiled. Tell them you sometimes struggle to ask for help when you're over your head. Because you've had to be self-sufficient for a long time, and it doesn't come naturally to admit when you need something. And then tell them you're working on it by identifying one person in every environment you're in whose judgment you trust and making a point of checking in with them when something's outside your experience. Marcus wrote it down. That's true, by the way, Grant added. For me too. I'm just learning to manage it differently now. In late November, Lola called to tell him that they'd received funding offers from 2 firms and were leaning toward the Seattle-based impact investor they'd met with in their 3rd round of pitches. The valuation from the San Francisco firm is about 15% higher, Lola said. But the Seattle people, they actually want to understand what we're building. They asked follow-up questions about governance and employee ownership. The SF firm asked about exit timeline 3 times in the first meeting. Take the Seattle firm, Chad, Grant said without hesitation. You'd have told me to take the higher valuation 8 months ago. 8 months ago, I was an idiot who thought every decision was a negotiation with one winner. Grant set down the mug he'd been holding. The relationship you build with your investors will shape the company you become. Optimize for partners who will support your vision when it gets hard. There's always a time when what you're building looks like it might not work, and the difference between a company that survives that moment and one that doesn't is usually the people in the room when you're deciding what to do next. Lola was quiet for a moment. How do you know things like this and have them not have applied to anything you did before? Because knowing and doing are different skills, Grant said. I knew. I just never believed the knowing applied to me. He paused. I was wrong about that. It took losing everything to find out. I'd rather you found out some other way. Me too, Lola said. Thank you, Grant. Really? Thank Vivien, he said. She created the conditions under which I became useful. The book was growing. By early December, it had 50 pages, honest, specific, structured around particular decisions and what had driven them and what they'd cost and what they would have cost less if he'd known then what he'd learned the hard way. He wasn't sure it was a book yet. He wasn't sure it was more than extended notes toward one, but he was writing it, which meant something was being built, even if he couldn't yet see the shape of the finished thing. Dr. Morrison asked him in their last session before the year ended whether he thought about Vivien often. Yes, Grant said without the defensive hedge he would have reached for in the early sessions. Not with longing, not with regret in the way that wants something undone. He thought about it. With respect, I think, and something that's probably gratitude, though it took me a long time to arrive at that word. He paused. She gave me 20 years to choose differently. And when I didn't, she did what she had to do. And the thing she had to do happened to also be exactly what I needed. He looked at his hands. That's a remarkable thing to do for someone who treated you the way I treated her. It is, Dr. Morrison agreed. I don't think I'll ever quite understand it. You don't have to understand it, she said. You just have to be worth it. Grant looked out the window at the December city. I'm working on that, he said. I know, she said. That's why we still have somewhere to go. 2 years after the Celestia Grand Gala, Grant Holston stood in the reception area of Hartwell Dominion's headquarters and waited. He had requested this appointment 3 months ago through Damon Klein's office because he'd understood that going directly calling Vivien's number, emailing her personal address showing up unannounced would be the wrong approach, and he had reached the point in his understanding of himself where he could distinguish between the impulse and the right action and choose the right action even when the impulse was stronger. The building had changed since his last visit. The lobby of what had been Holston Industries was brighter now, more open with natural light admitted through panels he'd never considered installing and artwork on the walls by local artists whose names appeared on small plaques beside each piece. The front desk was staffed by 2 people who greeted him by name and with the easy warmth of people who worked somewhere that actively supported them doing that. A mission statement was prominently displayed near the elevator bank building with integrity. Growing with purpose. Accountable to everyone we touch. His reflection in the lobby's glass showed a man who looked different from the person who had arrived at the Celestia Grand 2 years ago with Lola Reyes on his arm, and arrogance in every line of him. This Grant was 54 grayer, with the particular kind of lines around his eyes that came from actual emotion rather than strategic presentation. He wore an off-the-rack suit that fit him properly, but without ostentation. He carried a worn leather bag that had been a birthday present from Sarah Webb, who had noted when she gave it to him that the one he'd been using cost more than her first car and made her feel vaguely anxious on his behalf. He looked, he thought, like someone who worked for a living. Mr. Holston, the receptionist smiled. Miss Hart will see you now. Top floor, her assistant will meet you. He rode up in the elevator alone. The top floor had been redesigned as Vivien's executive suite, elegant, but not ostentatious, with windows that admitted the full expanse of Crown City's skyline in the late afternoon winter light. Framed photographs lined the walls Hartwell Dominion projects. Affordable housing developments with rooftop gardens. A community center in a neighborhood that had needed one for a decade. A job training facility on the north side, the one funded by Vivien's $5 million donation, the one that had been the last public act of her marriage to Grant, and the first public act of whatever she had become after it. Her assistant greeted him with professional warmth and asked him to wait in the conference room. He waited, studying the photographs, reading the project descriptions on the plaques beneath them. What Hartwell Dominion was building looked nothing like what Holston Industries had built. And the difference was not just aesthetic. Holston Industries had built things that made money. Hartwell Dominion was building things that made money and made the city better. And it was doing so at a scale that was demonstrating with the kind of evidence that business analysts were beginning to cite in the publications that had once covered Grant's empire, that you could do both. That the either-or had always been a choice, not a constraint. The door opened. Vivien entered. She wore a navy suit that was both professional and distinctly her own, not costumed authority, but genuine presence. Her auburn hair was swept into the same elegant chignon she'd worn to the gala 2 years ago, which made Grant briefly aware of how much else had changed while that had stayed the same. She looked healthy, purposeful, like a woman who was exactly where she had decided to be. Grant, she said, extending her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm and warm and professionally complete, the handshake of someone who had no anxiety about this meeting and no need for the exchange to be more than it was. Thank you for agreeing to see me, he said. Your email said you had something to give me. She gestured for him to sit, took the chair across the table, and regarded him with the direct, clear-eyed attention. He remembered the attention he had spent 23 years failing to return in kind. I do, Grant said. He reached into the leather bag and produced a slim folder, which he slid across the table. Vivien opened it. Her expression shifted in a way that was subtle but legible to someone who had spent a long time learning to read what she was actually communicating rather than what she'd arranged for public consumption. These are your shares, she said, in Hartwell Dominion, all of them. 25%, Grant confirmed. Transferred to you free and clear, no conditions, no strings, no expectations of anything in return. He kept his voice even. He'd rehearsed this with Dr. Morrison until he could deliver it without the quaver that had attended every earlier practice run. I've spent 2 years learning that real power comes from integrity and not from control. Part of that means acknowledging that you built this company into something better than I ever could have. You don't need my shares to maintain control, you already have that. But you deserve to own entirely what you created. Vivien studied him. He recognized the assessment in her eyes, the analytical evaluation she brought to everything that mattered. The same intelligence he had spent 2 decades not noticing because he'd been too occupied with his own assessments to pay attention to hers. I don't want anything, Grant said, answering the question she hadn't asked aloud. I'm not trying to manipulate you or create obligation or purchase forgiveness for something that isn't purchasable anyway. I think you should have complete ownership of what you built. Consider it a very late correction of a very old mistake. Vivien set the folder down. Her fingers rested lightly on its edge. This is worth millions of dollars, she said. I have enough, Grant said. The consulting work, the advisory equity in Lola's company, the book royalties. He paused, and something in him registered the strangeness of the sentence. Book royalties. He had written a book. It had been published 4 months ago. It had done considerably better than his publisher had predicted, and considerably better than Grant had allowed himself to hope, which doctor Morrison had observed was evidence of progress on the unrealistic pessimism that had replaced his earlier unrealistic optimism as his default setting. I have enough. And you earned this. Vivien looked at the folder for a long moment, then looked back at him. Why now? She asked. Why not 2 years ago when we first separated? Because 2 years ago I was still too angry and too hurt to see clearly, Grant said. I thought you'd stolen my company, destroyed my reputation, ruined my life out of spite. It took a long time and a significant amount of professional help to understand that you did what you had to do to protect yourself from someone who was hurting you, and that everything you've built since then is entirely your accomplishment, and I have no legitimate claim on any of it. He paused. It also took that long to become someone who could make this offer without wanting something for it. Vivien was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, Crown City's winter afternoon was moving toward evening, the skyline beginning to gather light at its edges. I heard about your book, she said finally. I know. Lola mentioned you read it. Patricia sent me an advance copy. A brief slight smile. You thanked her in the acknowledgments. She was very moved. She deserved to be acknowledged, Grant said. She spent 15 years working for you and then spent 3 years working for me, reporting to you the whole time while feeling terrible about it because she has genuine integrity and she knew what she was doing conflicted with her own ethical standards. The fact that it was the right thing to do didn't make it easy for her. She's still with the company, Vivien said. Senior VP of Operations now. She should have been running something years ago, Grant said. I underutilized her along with about a dozen other people I treated as infrastructure rather than talent. He looked at the folder on the table. That was in the book too. I know. I read it. The acknowledgement landed with a weight that was not quite what he'd expected. He'd known she'd read it, had known, at some level, when he was writing certain passages, that she was among the people he was writing for, the people for whom the accuracy and completeness of what he'd gotten wrong mattered more than how it reflected on him. But hearing her say it directly was different. What did you think? He asked. Vivien considered the question with the care it deserved. I thought it was honest, she said. More honest than I expected, and I expected a great deal. She paused. I thought the chapter about the anniversary letters was the most important part, not because it was about me, but because it was about the cost of not paying attention to the person you're supposed to be paying the most attention to. She met his eyes. I think it will help people. I think it will make some people build things differently and treat the people in their lives differently because they read it. That's worth more than most things I've seen you build. Grant sat with that for a moment. Thank you, he said, and meant it in a way that was different from the way he'd said it to people for most of his life, not as social oil, not as professional courtesy, but as an actual expression of actual gratitude for something that actually mattered. Vivien picked up the folder again, considered it, set it down once more. I'll accept this, what? she said, on one condition. Grant's stomach tightened reflexively, then released. He'd been working on that reflex. What condition? That I use a portion of the share value to establish a fund in your name at Horizon Hope. You direct where the money goes: employment, training, housing transition support, whatever you think makes the most difference for the young people you've been working with. I want the kids who've been benefiting from your teaching to benefit from your decision to do the right thing rather than the strategic thing. It was not what he'd expected. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, she said simply. You gave me complete ownership of something significant. I want to honor that by making sure it creates value beyond my bottom line. That's what this company is about now, not just shareholder returns, but actual value for the people we're connected to. She regarded him steadily. You understand that philosophy better than you used to. I'm learning, Grant said. Then this is the right vehicle for the learning. They looked at each other across the conference table. Two people who had once been married, who had once done significant damage to each other and been changed by it, who had arrived separately and at some cost at versions of themselves that were better than the versions that had occupied the Riverside mansion for 23 years. There's something else, Grant said. He'd prepared for this too, with Dr. Morrison's help across several sessions in which he'd worked through whether to say it and how. I read your letters, all 20 of them. I read them over and over until I understood what they meant. Vivien's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. I know, she said quietly. Lola told me. She told you I kept them in the wooden box. Yes. They were... Grant stopped. Started again. They were a record of everything I failed to see while I was busy being certain that I knew what was important. You tried for 20 years to reach me. You documented the attempt with the patience of someone who genuinely believed the person on the other side was worth reaching. He held her gaze. I wasn't. But the fact that you believed I was for 20 years is something I will carry for the rest of my life. Vivien was quiet for a moment. I believed in the man you could have been, she said finally. Not quite the man you were. A pause. You're becoming closer to him now. I'm trying, Grant said. That's about all I can honestly claim. It's enough, Vivien said. Trying and being honest about the trying, that's the whole of it, really. She signed the share transfer documents, initialed in the required locations, passed them back to Grant to countersign, and they completed the transaction with the focused efficiency of two people who had become, without planning it, genuinely good at getting through difficult things. When the paperwork was done, Vivien walked him to the elevator. They stood in front of it in the same hallway where her assistant had met him 40 minutes ago, and the distance between who they had been and who they were now felt in that particular moment neither too large to acknowledge nor too small to honor. Take care of yourself, Grant, she said. You too. He paused, then said the thing he'd also prepared and decided was worth saying. Thank you for what you did. Not the gala, not the destruction of it, though I understand why it was necessary. Thank you for sending the letters with my things. Thank you for suggesting Lola work with me. Thank you for writing that last note. He met her eyes. You had no obligation to any of it. You had every right to walk away from everything and leave me to work out the rest alone. You didn't. Vivien regarded him with the thoughtful directness that had always been there and that he had spent most of their marriage declining to receive. You were worth the effort, she said. Eventually. The elevator doors opened. Grant stepped in and turned back to look at her for the last time in what he understood would be the last time. She stood in the hallway of the company she'd built, in the suit she'd chosen, in the life she'd made clear-eyed and certain and entirely her own, and she offered him a small nod that contained somehow everything that didn't need to be said. Goodbye, Vivien, Grant said. Goodbye, Grant. A slight smile. Go build something real. The elevator doors closed. He descended through the floors of Hartwell Dominion with the particular lightness of someone who has set down something heavy they'd been carrying for a long time and didn't notice how heavy it had been until the moment they let it go. He walked out of the building into the early December evening. The street was full of the ordinary winter energy of a city. Going about its business, people moving with purpose in the cold air, the smell of coffee from a cart on the corner, A couple negotiating the logistics of their evening in the efficient, affectionate shorthand of people who've been doing this a long time. Grant stood on the sidewalk for a moment, hands in his coat pockets, breathing the cold air. His phone buzzed. Lola. We signed the Seattle term sheet this morning. Official. I'm choosing not to scream in the office, but it's a near thing. Thank you for everything. He smiled and typed back, You did the work. I just told you not to make my mistakes. Congratulations. Her response arrived immediately. Vivien says hi, by the way. We had lunch today. She asked about you. Grant stood on the sidewalk and read that twice. Tell her I'm well, he typed. Tell her the thing she always knew was true, turned out to be true. He put the phone in his pocket and started walking. 3 months later, Grant sat in the back of a bookstore in Crown City's historic district for the final stop of the publication tour for the Empire of One Lessons in What Not to Do. The room was full, folding chairs arranged in rows, people standing along the walls, the particular electric anticipation of a crowd that had come because they'd heard this was worth coming to. He looked out at the audience and saw faces he recognized. His students from the community college, half a dozen of them clustered near the left wall. Destiny Williams in the front row, her expression holding the contained expectancy of someone who had decided to show up and form her own opinion. David beside her with a notebook already open. 4 teenagers from Horizon Hope Marcus among them, sitting with the slightly self-conscious dignity of someone on unfamiliar territory who has decided to be there regardless in the 3rd row. Lola in the front row with James Park, her co-founder, and 2 members of the team they'd assembled over the past 8 months. She caught Grant's eye and gave a small, composed nod that held real warmth. And in the back of the bookstore, barely visible against the wall, 2 women standing together. One of them was Eleanor Jameson, Horizon Hope's executive director, who wore the expression of someone quietly satisfied with how things had developed. The other was Vivien Hart. Grant hadn't invited her. It hadn't occurred to him to invite her. This was his event, his book, his public accounting, and inviting Vivien would have made it about their story rather than about the lessons he was trying to convey to other people. But she had come anyway, which was exactly like her, and which meant, in the context of everything he now understood about how she operated, that she had decided this was worth showing up to. Their eyes met across the crowded bookstore. Vivien smiled. Not at him exactly, or not only at him, but at what they had both become through the particular brutal process of letting go of what they'd been. She gave him a small nod of acknowledgement. Then she turned her attention to the event, indicating clearly and with characteristic efficiency that whatever meaning this moment held, it was complete and the next thing could begin. Grant opened his book. He looked out at the room, at the students and the teenagers, and Lola and James and Eleanor and Vivien and the 50 or 60 other people who had come because something about the premise of the book had reached them. He looked at all of them, and he thought about the 30 years he'd spent building things that didn't hold the weight he put on them, and the 2 years he'd spent discovering what actually did. I want to start with something I got completely wrong, he said. The room went quiet. For most of my adult life, I believed that power was the most important thing a person could have. Not power over other people exactly, though I exercise that too, and I'll get to it, but power in the sense of invulnerability. The absolute certainty that the ground beneath you was solid because you'd built it yourself and you controlled everything standing on it. He paused. What I didn't understand, what took me 52 years and the most spectacular public humiliation Crown City has seen in recent memory to understand, is that the kind of power I was building was the kind that requires everything to keep going right. The moment one thing goes wrong, all of it goes wrong. He looked out at the room. Real power is different. Real power is what you have when other people trust you. When the people around you can count on you to mean what you say and do what you've said and be honest when you've gotten it wrong. He set the book down on the lectern. Everything else is just leverage, and leverage always runs out. He read for 30 minutes. Passages about the company, about the marriage, about the mechanics of how a person dismantles what they care most about through 1,000 small decisions to prioritize themselves over everything else. He read the chapter about the anniversary letters. He read the passage he'd written about Patricia, about what it meant to have built a machine for his own deception out of a person who had integrity, and what it said about him that he hadn't noticed the contradiction until he was sitting in a conference room with Damon Klein. When the reading ended, questions came fast, and from every direction. A young man near the back asked the question that several people in the room appeared to have been building toward, Do you think your ex-wife was right to do what she did? The public thing, reading the text, announcing the divorce in front of everyone? Grant thought about it. Yes, he said. Without qualification, what Vivien did was exactly what I needed delivered in the only way that would have reached me. He paused. I had spent 20 years insulating myself from consequences. Private confrontation would have given me the opportunity to manage it, to spin it, control the narrative, make promises I would have believed I intended to keep and wouldn't have. Vivien understood that. The only way to create real accountability for someone who had spent 30 years making himself impossible to hold accountable was to do it where I couldn't manage it. He looked out at the room. She was right. It was brutal. It was right. From the back of the room, he was aware of Vivien standing very still against the wall. Destiny Williams raised her hand. You talk a lot in the book about learning to value yourself separate from your achievements, she said. But your whole talk tonight has been about what you've built in the past 2 years. The teaching, the advising, the book. How is that different from what you were doing before? It was the sharpest question of the night, and Grant had known it was coming because Destiny always asked the sharpest question. The difference, he said, is why I'm doing it and who benefits from it. He held her gaze. Everything I built before was designed to make me feel powerful and important. Every deal, every acquisition, every achievement, it was all oriented toward my own sense of worth. The things I'm building now are oriented toward what they do for other people. The teaching matters because of what it does for the students. The advising matters because of what it might do for the company Lola and James are building. The book matters if it matters because it might help someone avoid the particular kind of damage I did. He paused. I won't pretend that's completely altruistic. I still get something from it. But what I get is connection and meaning rather than power and status. Those are different things. He paused again. They're better things. Destiny considered this for a moment. Okay, she said. That's a real answer. The event wound down with the natural, unhurried drift of a room that has been engaged and is reluctant to fully release. People approached with books to sign and questions that hadn't fit the Q&A and observations they wanted to share. Grant signed and answered and received it all with the present attention of someone who had learned finally that the person in front of you is worth the full extent of what you have to give. Marcus, the 17-year-old from Horizon Hope, appeared at the edge of the crowd with the slightly awkward confidence of a teenager who has decided to do something slightly outside his usual parameters and is committed to seeing it through. Hey, he said. Hey, Grant said. I read some of it, Marcus said, holding up a copy of the book. The parts about your dad going bankrupt and stuff. About being scared all the time and building things to stop being scared. He looked at Grant with the directness that had always been his particular gift. That made sense to me. Grant looked at him. I thought it might, he said. Can you sign it? Grant signed it to Marcus, who asked the right questions before I knew how to answer them, and handed it back. Marcus looked at the inscription. Something shifted in his expression briefly before the teenage composure reassembled itself. Thanks, he said, and disappeared back into the crowd. The crowd thinned gradually. Eleanor Jameson stopped to say a few warm words about the Hartwell Dominion Foundation grant and what it was funding at Horizon Hope. Lola and James came forward, Lola carrying 2 copies of the book, one for herself and one for a friend she'd mentioned to Grant, someone going through a divorce who was struggling to understand what had happened, and the 3 of them talked for a few minutes with the easy, genuine warmth of people who had built something real together. Eventually, the bookstore was nearly empty. Grant was gathering his things when he looked up and found Vivien standing a few feet away, Eleanor having moved on to say goodbye to the event organizer. She held a copy of the book with the particular care of someone who has been holding something for a while and has become comfortable with the weight of it. You didn't have to come, Grant said. I know, Vivien said. I wanted to. A brief silence. Outside the bookstore windows, Crown City's December evening had settled into its full winter dark, the street lit with the warm, particular light of shops still open and people still moving. The dedication, Vivien said. I read it when I got the book. The dedication was a single page. Grant had written and rewritten it a dozen times before settling on the final version. For Vivien, who loved me enough to tell the truth even when it hurt, and who taught me that sometimes the kindest thing you can do for someone is refuse to let them keep destroying themselves. Thank you for the gift of consequences. I meant every word of it, Grant said. I know, Vivien said. That's why I came. She held out the book. He took it and opened it to the dedication page, and she waited while he signed it with the same pen he'd used to sign the share transfer documents at the top-floor conference room 2 hours ago. He wrote, "You were always the point. I was just slow to see it." He handed it back. She read it. Something moved through her expression, not sadness, not grief, but something quieter and more complete. The acknowledgement of a chapter that had been fully resolved. "Take care of yourself, Grant," she said with the warmth of someone who means it entirely and is free from the weight of needing anything back. "You too," he said. She smiled at him genuinely freely, the smile of a woman who had built exactly the life she chose and was standing in it, and then she turned and walked out of the bookstore into the winter evening. Grant stood in the emptying room and watched her go. He stood there for a long moment after she'd disappeared into the Crown City night, thinking about what she'd once written to him be well V, and understanding finally what those two words had always contained. Not forgiveness exactly, not absolution, but the genuine unconditional wish for someone to find their way to who they could have been all along. He picked up his bag. He walked out of the bookstore into the December air, which was cold and clear and smelled of the season. He had a dinner with Marcus and Sarah in 40 minutes. He had a session with Dr. Morrison on Thursday. He had a call with Lola's team on Friday to review the Q1 projections. He had, in the ordinary sense, a life, not the life he'd built and lost, but the one he was building now, which was smaller and quieter and held considerably more weight. He had been given the gift of consequences. He had spent 2 years learning what to do with it. He started walking. Behind him, the bookstore's lights stayed on. Inside, the last copies of The Empire of One sat in their stacks, waiting for whoever came next, whoever opened the first page and recognized something in the first lines that made them think, maybe this is worth learning before it costs me everything. In the dedication, they would find a woman's name. And if they were paying attention the way Grant had eventually finally learned to pay attention, they would understand that the most important story in the book was not the one about the man who built and lost an empire. It was the one about the woman who had always known what mattered, and who had waited patiently and strategically and with 20 years of documented hope for the moment when she could prove it. She had built something better than what came before. She was still building. And somewhere in Crown City tonight, in the company she'd made her own and the life she'd made entirely on her own terms, Vivien Hart was exactly where she had chosen to be, which had always, it turned out, been the point. End. The weeks that followed the book tour settled into the steady rhythm of a life that had finally found its own tempo. Not the relentless forward momentum of his years building Holston Industries, not the paralyzed fog of the months immediately after the gala, but something in between that he was beginning to recognize as simply his life. He taught his final session of the semester at the community college. On a Tuesday morning, standing at the front of a room that now held 42 students, the course had grown from the original 20 as word spread that the disgraced executive was teaching something worth hearing, and he found that the shaking in his hands that had attended the very first session was entirely gone. Not because he was less invested, but because the investment had changed character. In the early sessions, he'd been performing accountability, working from the script he'd assembled in Dr. Morrison's office. Now, he was just talking, saying what he understood to people who might be able to use it. "I want to leave you with something for the break," he said to the 42 students who were already collecting their bags and checking their phones with the particular end-of-semester energy of people ready to be elsewhere. "Not an assignment, just a thought." They looked up. Every person in this room is going to be in a situation at some point in your career where you can take what you want or do what's right, and taking what you want will be considerably easier. There will be a version of the situation where taking what you want doesn't even feel wrong, where you can construct a narrative that makes it look reasonable, even deserved. He looked out at them. "I was very good at constructing those narratives. I constructed them for 30 years. They were internally consistent and deeply convincing, and they were all wrong. The room had gone quiet in the particular way of people who recognize when they're being told something true. The thing I didn't understand, and this is what I want you to sit with over the break, is that the person you're becoming in every one of those moments is more important than the thing you're acquiring. Every decision you make is a vote for who you are. If you consistently vote for taking the easy path for your own advantage over what's right, you become someone who is very good at getting what they want and very lonely in possession of it. He let that sit for a moment. "That's all," he said. "Enjoy your break." The students filed out, several stopping to say things that Grant received with genuine attention rather than the managed warmth he'd once deployed in lieu of actual presence. Destiny stopped last, as she often did. "I've been thinking about something you said in week 4, she said, "about how the skills that make you successful in business can destroy you everywhere else if you're not careful about when and how you use them." "What about it?" Grant asked. "I think it goes the other way too," Destiny said. "The skills that make you good at being a person, patience, honest, attention, being willing to be wrong, those make you better at business too. Eventually, when you have enough of them." Grant looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's right. I learned that part more slowly than you just did." Destiny shrugged. "You didn't have someone telling you at 21. She picked up her bag. "Happy holidays, Mr. Holston." "Happy holidays, Destiny." He drove from the community college to Horizon Hope, where the afternoon employment training session was already underway in the conference room that had been repainted during the renovation funded by the Hartwell Dominion Grant. 8 kids today, ranging from 16 to 19 at various stages of the job application process. Grant moved through the room, checking progress, answering questions, reading over cover letters with the particular combination of honesty and encouragement that he'd learned slowly was the most useful thing he could offer. Marcus, the 17-year-old who'd been preparing for his first interview 6 months ago, had landed a position at a local architecture firm as a facilities assistant and had since referred 3 of his friends from foster care to the Horizon Hope program. He stopped by once a week now, not for services, but to talk with the newer kids in the way that someone who has just gotten through something can talk to someone about, to go through it from the inside with specificity, with the authority of recent experience. Eleanor Jameson found Grant in the hallway after the session. "I want to show you something," she said. She led him to her office and pulled up the foundation's annual impact report on her computer, the numbers for the year that was closing. 312 young people served, 140 in stable housing, 87 in employment or continuing education, 17 in their second year of the job training program. "The Northside facility opens in March," Eleanor said. "The one funded by Vivien's donation. We've already had 200 applications for the first intake." Grant looked at the numbers. 2 years ago, Eleanor said, this organization had enough funding to serve 150 young people and was running 3 months behind on payroll. Now we have an endowment, a second facility, and a wait list. She looked at him. "You know who made that possible." "Vivien did," Grant said. "Vivien started it," Eleanor corrected. "But you showing up here week after week doing the unglamorous work of sitting with teenagers who have every reason to distrust adults, that's made something else possible. It's made this feel like a place where people come and stay, not just donate and disappear." She paused. "You're part of this now, Grant, in a real way." Grant drove back to the Meridian. He still lived there, though he'd begun looking in a gradual, unpressured way for something permanent, and sat at his desk with the accumulated quiet of a day that had contained the things that mattered. He opened his laptop and found an email from his publisher forwarding a review of the book that had appeared that morning in a national business publication, one that had covered his downfall with particular enthusiasm 2 years ago. The review was long and considered and reached in its final paragraph a conclusion that Grant read 3 times. "What makes the empire of one worth reading is not its account of failure. Business literature has no shortage of those, but its account of what failure makes possible when a person is willing to do something harder than rebuilding, becoming instead someone worth knowing. Holston arrives at no triumphant restoration of what he lost. He arrives at something better. At a life where the work matters because of what it does for others, and relationships are real because they're not built on advantage. He is by his own account still in progress. The honesty of that admission is the book's most persuasive argument for everything else it contains. Grant read it a fourth time. He closed the laptop. He picked up his phone and sent a single text to Marcus Webb Review in the Journal today. Good one. Thought you'd want to know. Marcus's response came 30 seconds later. Sarah's going to frame it. Fair warning, Grant smiled. He put the phone down. Outside the Meridian's windows, Crown City had completed its turn into the full dark of a December evening, the kind of winter night when the city looked from 23 floors up like something constructed entirely from light. Buildings he had once been certain defined his place in the world. Streets he had moved through for 30 years as someone who owned things rather than someone who belonged to them. He understood the difference now. He was learning to belong. He opened his laptop again and started a new document. He had been asked to write a foreword for a collection of essays on ethical leadership being published by Crown City Community College. A small thing, a few pages, not the kind of project that would have merited his attention 2 years ago, and which now felt without irony like the kind of project worth doing carefully. He thought for a moment, then typed, "The most important thing I've learned in the past 2 years isn't anything about leadership or business or ethics as concepts. It's something considerably simpler that the people around you know who you are before you do. They see long before you're ready to see it yourself, whether you're building something that deserves to exist or something that serves only you. The work of becoming a person worth knowing is mostly the work of learning to see yourself the way the people who've been watching you see you honestly, without the story you've been telling yourself about your own motives. I had a woman in my life for 23 years who saw me clearly and tried in every way available to her to show me what she saw. I wasn't ready to look. By the time I was, she'd had to make sure I had no choice. I'm grateful to her for that, in the complicated way you're grateful for something that hurt you and saved you simultaneously. What follows in this collection are essays by people doing the hard work of building things, companies, programs, teams, organizations, in ways that earn the trust of the people they're building with. I have been privileged to teach some of them. I have been more privileged to learn from them. And I have been most privileged finally to understand that the learning was always available. I was just for a very long time too certain I already knew. He sat back and read what he'd written. It was, he thought, honest. It was true. It said what needed to be said without saying more than was necessary. He saved the document. He went to the kitchen and made coffee the way Vivien had spent a Saturday morning in their 5th year of marriage, teaching him properly, attentively, with the small care that the process deserved. He carried the cup back to the desk and sat in the quiet December evening with the warm weight of it in his hands. In Crown City tonight, in the Northside facility that would open in March, 312 young people had somewhere to be. In the bookstore's remaining inventory, copies of a book with a dedication to a woman named Vivien were waiting for whoever needed them. In a company called Hartwell Dominion, the work of building something better than what came before was continuing under the leadership of someone who had always known what mattered. And in a startup office on the east side of the financial district, Lola Reyes and James Park and their team were building something that might, if the Seattle investors' confidence was warranted, change the way small businesses prove their integrity to the world. Grant Holston had been part of making a few of those things possible. He was learning to accept that as enough. He drank his coffee. He went back to writing. Outside Crown City kept going, indifferent, purposeful, alive, and he was at last genuinely part of it. Not as the most important person in the room, just as someone who showed up, did the work, and meant what he said, which he had finally learned was everything.